The story begins with a violent explosion on a cliff, and as the dust begins to settle, a man approaches, striking downward with a powerful blow. The other man laughs, impressed, asking how it is that his opponent is still able to move despite such a severe injury. Before he added an elaboration that his mental fortitude matches his title of the Phantom Swordsman. He admits that the sword technique his opponent created is impressive, but with a push backward, he adds that the Phantom Swordsman won't be able to use internal energy in his current state. He pushed the injured man with more power before he spoke once more. It is miraculous enough that he is still able to move, and there's no need to continue fighting, as he plans to end it and put his opponent to sleep. Imbuing a purple aura into his blade, the man draws it back and swings forward, sending multiple sword arc made of inner energy of attacks at the Phantom Swordsman. While his opponent is busy deflecting them, the man rushes in, delivering a powerful kick to his gut, causing the Phantom Swordsman to fall to the ground. The man then stabs downward toward his head, but the Phantom Swordsman rolls to the side to avoid it. He quickly counters, delivering a kick that knocks the man's sword from his grasp, sending it flying through the air. The Phantom Swordsman grabs his own blade and thrusts forward, but the man dodges, though the blade still grazes his cheek. The Phantom Swordsman follows up with a left hook to the man's face, knocking him to the ground. The man, now lying on the floor, insists that he won't let his opponent win. He imbues inner energy into his hands and releases an aura wave, despite being unarmed. To his surprise, he finds that the Phantom Swordsman is no longer there, leaving him to wonder where he has gone. As he looks up, horror spreads across his face, just in time to see the Phantom Swordsman descending from the air. In a single swift motion, the Phantom Swordsman cuts him down the middle. The scene shifts to another man, sighing in relief. He asks the Phantom Swordsman if he has killed the old demon head, to which the Phantom Swordsman confirms. With the old demon head gone, the bloodbath, the Shangxi massacre, will finally come to an end. The man refers to the mysterious group known as the Black Knight Palace, who had swept through numerous smaller sects and clans in the last 3 days. He reflects on how the world was able to witness the alliance of 2 rival factions, the Orthodox and Unorthodox, because of this incident. The Phantom Swordsman's true name is revealed to be Dako Hien, and the other man recalls a promise they made to duel after creating their own sword techniques. Sadly, he admits that he will not be able to fulfill it. When asked if that is what he's thinking about in his final moments, the man responds affirmatively, laughing. He has dedicated his entire life to the sword and has fought countless martial artists, witnessing many techniques. Yet, none have been as difficult to deal with as the Phantom Swordsman's. His devotion to the sword surpasses all others, and because of that, he asks the Phantom Swordsman to look after his disciple in Manhwa Sect. Dako Hien, surprised, asks if the man has lost his mind, especially since the disciple belongs to the Manhwa Sect. He is asking why the best swordsman of the unorthodox faction would look after a disciple of the orthodox faction. The dying man hands him a beaded circlet, the plum blossom spirit beads, a relic of Manhwa, and asks him to give it to the sect leader. Dako Hien wonders if the man is truly out of his mind, but soon realizes that this is the earnest wish of a dying man. The man laughs, saying that they are only sword friends, but he has always been grateful. Dako Hien agrees, noting that he will spend the rest of his life at Manhwa, thanks to his friend. Before he can finish his sentence, the man's body explodes, turning into red mist, leaving only chunks of his remains behind. Dako Hien is left stunned, wondering what just happened. He turns, only to see a purple light as an inner energy flies toward him. Gritting his teeth, Dako Hien tightens his grip on his blade and asks who is responsible for this, returning a swing to deflect the attack. However, the aura wave is too powerful and destroys his counterattack effortlessly. In genuine surprise, Dako Hien watches as his opponent begins preparing 2 black-purple concentration of inner energy, 1 in each hand. The ensuing blast can only be described as epitome of a destruction. When the smoke clears, Dako Hien, now missing an arm and severely injured, sits on his knees, questioning how someone could be so powerful. As he approaches his own final moments, he wonders if this is the Night Palace Master, though he quickly dismisses the idea, knowing that the old demon head is still dead and his corpse remains intact. It seemed that the mysterious figure was either a hidden disciple or, perhaps, the true Night Palace Master, much stronger than the imposter he had killed. Hien, gazing at his severed arm, murmurs an apology, regretful that he never had the chance to bring his long friend's body back home. It seems both of them will die on this cliff, but with determination, Heian slams his hand onto his knee, promising that, at the very least, he will keep his word. The other man watches in surprise as Heian charges forward to fight, unarmed and undeterred. Heian himself isn't sure if he will survive the fall from the cliff after losing his companion. But if there is any hope, he has to believe in it. Though he may be fleeing now, he will never forget his fallen friend. When they meet again, it will be for the final confrontation. But of course, that chance will never come. Just as Heian runs, an attack cuts him directly in half. He turns in shock, realizing that the masked man launched the attack from a distance, his power much greater than Heian had initially thought. The masked man laughs after landing the blow, prompting Heian to retort that such laughter is disrespectful, especially in someone's final moments. As he begins to fall, his final words are an apology to his friend, admitting that he likely won't be able to keep the promise he made. The spirit beads on his hand start glowing brightly, and below, in the forest, the light is radiated. People say they can feel his pulse, marveling that the heavens have indeed helped him. Heian, now regaining consciousness, is astonished. He opens his eyes and hears people calling him senior disciple. One of the men yells for an elder, who rushes to Heian's side, calling him Muhoi, praising him for surviving. Heian, confused, recognizes the elder as the Manhwa Sect's elder, Baekjin, but wonders why the man keeps calling him Muhoi. After all, Muhoi is the senior disciple of Manhwa's second-generation disciples and his own friend, Hyunjo's disciple. Heian wonders if the elder has lost his mind. The elder tells him not to speak as his wounds haven't fully healed. Heian begins to realize that he might be forced to live in Manhwa after all. After some time, Dako Heian begins to leave, and the elder asks if he is going. Dako Heian acknowledges, almost responding rudely, but Baekjin advises him not to push himself too hard, as he had been bedridden and unable to eat for the past week. Dako Heian agrees and steps outside, where the sights of a giant well and a grand temple greet him. He heads toward the garden area, splashing water onto his face, reflecting on the past week. Though only 7 days have passed, it feels as though years have passed to him. He has dreamt of an entire life, reliving the last 2 decades that Muhoi experienced. It is revealed that their sect had been attacked. One of their buildings explodes and soldiers are fighting valiantly, but the situation seems dire. Standing among the chaos is none other than the Black Knight Palace Master, or at least, the imposter he had seen earlier. As Dako Heian learns Muhoi's life, he hears Hyunjo shouting at the masked man before charging in to confront him. Muhoi watches as a man raises a weapon to kill one of his fellow disciples, and without hesitation, he dashes forward to block the attack. However, he is struck across the chest, falling to the ground like a warrior from that attack. Dako Heian, seeing this, calls Muhoi a fool, asking why he would throw himself in harm's way when his body was so weak. The injury proves fatal, and Dako Heian realizes that the light from earlier must have come from the spirit beads. Now he wonders why it had to be him. Why Muhoi, and not Hyunjo? Wondering whether that is fate. Sighing, Dako Heian acknowledges that, despite his reluctance, he cannot waste this second chance at life. He vows to find the masked man and exact his revenge, determined to become stronger than ever before. After all, he had nearly perished at the hands of the imposter, and if he hoped to defeat him, he would need to surpass his previous limits. Dako Heian walks up the steps to an empty training room, likely Hyunjo's, and reflects on his late friend's final words. Hyunjo had led their disciples bravely, urging them to protect their home without fear. As Dako Heian picks up a book from the wall, he makes a promise to fulfill Hyunjo's last request and avenge his death, no matter the cost. The scene shifts to a discussion among the elders, who are deliberating whether they need to rebuild a total of 8 pavilions. Among them informs the sect leader that the damage has been worsened because they were unable to extinguish the last ambush's fire in time. The sect leader sighs, assuming that they lack the funds for such an extensive project due to prior damages. He turns to Baek-san, asking if that is the case. Baek-san confirms, adding that profits and visitors will be drastically reduced. He appears to be the one in charge of the sect's finances. The sect leader falls silent, concluding that large expenditures must be avoided, suggesting they should start with the most important pavilions. His name is Baekyu. He then turns to Baekjin, asking how the disciples are recovering. Baek Jin responds that they are all recovering well, and even those in serious condition are improving. Baek Yu is relieved, but asks about Muhoi, expressing concern that the news of Hyunjo's death must have been a great shock. Baek Jin reassures him that Muhoi has taken it better than expected. His wounds have healed significantly, and he was walking around outside yesterday. Baek San laughs, questioning if Muhoi is truly feeling that much better. Baek Yu agrees that it's good if Muhoi is taking it well, but advises Baek Jin to check on him occasionally, worried that Muhoi might be pretending to be fine. He hopes that Muhoi will be alright, as they all know what kind of person he is. Meanwhile, Dako Hyun is inside the house, reading through martial arts manuals. As he reads, something catches his attention, triggering a memory of Hyunjo asking him about the disciples. Hyunjo had inquired what Dako Hyun thought of them, to which Dako Hyun had replied they were useless. Hyunjo agreed, noting that the sect seemed to be regressing. He found it ironic that they clung to the belief that the plum blossom sword technique, which represented variability and illusions, was perfection. Hyunjo was certain that Dako Hyun understood the future consequences of a sect that failed to reflect and innovate. Dako Hyun had pointed out that such stagnation could lead to their downfall. Hyunjo acknowledged the truth of this, but emphasized that change could not be forced. Dako Hyun, however, had insisted that if he were in Hyunjo's position, he would try to push for change, asking if Hyunjo had any other ideas. As the plum blossoms began to fall around them, Hyunjo shared his thoughts. He believed that the only way forward was to show the disciples that the plum blossom sword technique was not the end, but rather a stepping stone to a higher realm. Dako Hyun asked if this was why Hyunjo had made the promise to create their own sword techniques and duel in the future. Hyunjo explained that he had reached his current level by renovating various martial techniques, and he thought it might be possible for Dako Hyun, given his title as the Phantom Swordsman and his standing as the best swordsman in his faction. Dako Hyun, reflecting on his initial judgment of the Manhwa sect, admitted that he had once thought the problem lay in the sect's decline, unable to produce talent beyond Hyunjo for the last century. However, he now realized how foolish he had been. He had focused on martial arts techniques like the six-fold combo circulation technique and the sword technique itself, seeing them as flawless. But he now understood that martial techniques grow in power over time as they are passed through the hands of others. This was the true strength of a sect, and Manhwa had hit a wall because of its greatness. The sect's determination to break through that wall by showing the disciples a new realm was key. If Hyunjo's wish was to demonstrate this determination and lead the disciples to a higher understanding, then the unfinished sword technique would be Dako Hyun's to complete, as a way to honor their promise. This sword technique would need to reflect not just Manhwa's form and movements, but its deeper intentions. To achieve this, Dako Hyun realized he must align himself with the teachings of the sect and start from the basics. Only then could he complete Hyunjo's sword technique. Sitting in a lotus position, Dako Hyun begins cultivating his inner energy, letting out a slow exhale. He reflects on the need to let go of the martial arts teachings that Hyunjo had imparted to him. Even if he tried, he could not deny that they were part of him, and he could not underestimate the basics. The autumn flower circulation technique, for instance, was stable and not inferior to the ghost arts. In his past life, Dako Hyun had only sought efficiency and used unorthodox sword techniques. However, the techniques of the Manhwa sect were different, and he might learn something entirely new from them. This marked the end of his life as the Phantom Swordsman. From now on, Dako Hyun would fully embrace his new identity, Muhoi. Some time later, a man is seen heading up the stairs toward Muhoi's abode. He seems curious about something, calling out to Muhoi, asking if he's inside. Muhoi, looking noticeably tired, hears the voice and opens the door, surprising the man. He recognizes him as Muchiol, who explains that he came to check on Muhoi, noting that it's been 3 days since he left the Harmony Medicine Palace, yet Muhoi hasn't been attending the morning training sessions. Muhoi, startled, asks if it's really been 3 days. Muchiol stands in silence, and Muhoi reflects on the fact that he hadn't eaten properly for 7 days, which brings to mind his previous experience being trapped in the Blood Tempest sect's inescapable net technique. He says he lost track of time then as well. With that, he suggests they head to the training hall. Muchiol agrees, though it's clear he's thinking about something else, commenting that Muhoi seems different. Muhoi, undeterred, thinks that a drink would be nice, heading toward the training area. As they approach, they hear a man yelling out skill names and demonstrating them to a group of disciples. Muhoi watches as the disciples follow the instructor's commands, though they appear to be struggling. One disciple, Ryan, is told to raise his arm higher. He complies, but Muhoi observes that they're all performing terribly. Their feet move when they shouldn't, their balance is off, and they're unable to generate any real power in their strikes. Their posture is also completely wrong, and overall, they lack the basic skills. Muhoi acknowledges that the instructor, Mujin, isn't bad and at least seems to know what he's doing. He's the only one who's doing his job correctly. Muhoi reflects that Mujin is more like the senior disciple of the second generation, though he wonders why Mujin is the one leading the training rather than a senior disciple. It seems the previous owner of his body had a shy personality and lacked martial arts and leadership skills, but Mujin is different. He has the ability to lead, a calm demeanor, and has shown great potential since a young age. Muhoi thinks it's natural that more disciples listen to Mujin. Talented individuals with the right skills should be given opportunities, and Mujin's personality makes him a more natural fit for the role of senior disciple, at least for now. Mujin finishes the training session, telling the disciples to leave, noting that they all seem particularly beaten today. As they exit, one of them asks Muhoi if he's feeling all right. Muhoi replies that he's fine, but another disciple notices that something feels different about him. Mujin then steps down, apologizing for not properly greeting Muhoi earlier due to the training. Muhoi tells him it's fine, acknowledging that it must be difficult to handle the responsibilities that should have been his. He then wonders if he's not going to come down the stairs, which might be seen as rude. Mujin, however, just expresses gratitude that Muhoi is letting him take the lead. Muhoi then declares that from now on, he'll be taking over the responsibilities. Mujin looks irritated, and one of the disciples asks if she heard correctly. The others seem unsure, but Muchiol thinks to himself, remarking that he's not just being sensitive. Something has definitely changed about Muhoi. Mujin, frustrated, responds that he had given Mujin the task because he didn't have confidence that he could carry it out properly. Muhoi, smiling knowingly, thinks that he had suspected this all along. He then assumes that Mujin's ultimate goal is to become the head disciple. It is explained that the head disciple's role is one that carries the potential to succeed the sect leader. With the loss of many first-generation disciples due to the Shangxi massacre, the remaining elders are busy with the reconstruction of the sect. It would be far more efficient to guide the second-generation disciples who represent the future of the sect rather than attempting to change the elders or first-generation disciples. Muhoi also understands that the head disciple is the only one, aside from the sect leader, who can learn the purple aura circulation technique, one of the top 10 techniques for internal energy circulation. To surpass his previous self, Muhoi needs to master this technique, so he has no choice but to take on the role of head disciple. While it may be shocking, this is the path he must take. Mujin, skeptical, asks if Muhoi truly believes he is right in this decision. He questions what Muhoi did the night the Black Knight Palace invaded the sect. Muchiol interrupts, shouting Mujin's name as Mujin reminds him that the elders had told him to stay put, but Muhoi hadn't listened, and the consequences of that night followed. Muhoi smiles as Mujin continues questioning him, asking if he saved any of the elders or others during the invasion, or if he killed anyone from the Black Knight Palace. Muhoi shakes his head, admitting that he didn't save anyone. He only managed to burden them in the end. Mujin's expression shifts, realizing what Muhoi is getting at. He then states that because of Muhoi's actions, several disciples followed suit, and if the first-generation disciples hadn't risked their lives to protect everyone, many of them wouldn't be here now. Muhoi agrees, acknowledging that Mujin is right, but Mujin seems annoyed that he's simply accepting the blame without further explanation. Muhoi then declares that, as the senior disciple, he intends to take responsibility for everything moving forward. Mujin, not entirely convinced, asks how they are supposed to trust him now. Muhoi, already heading up the stairs, smirks and replies that Mujin is misunderstanding something. When Mujin asks what he means, Muhoi turns and, glaring at him, asks since when did he need to look up to him. He then asks if it sounds like he's trying to convince Mujin, or if he has to ask for permission in the choices he makes. Muhoi isn't trying to convince anyone. He's simply notifying them of his decisions. Mujin, clearly surprised, was shaken by the presence of the man in front of him, wondering what kind of person this was. This was definitely not the same senior disciple he knew, and it sent a chill through him. Muhoi, unfazed, tells him that he'll be taking over the morning training starting tomorrow. If Mujin has any complaints, he should come to see him after the training, but that he shouldn't get too upset about it. Mujin is still taken aback, muttering that Muhoi seems like a completely different person. Muhoi, still calm, says that people often change when they come back from the brink of death, and it's safe to assume that's what's happened to him. Meanwhile, the other disciples are gossiping about the change in Muhoi. They overhear Mujin's frustration and wonder if Muhoi really plans to take over the training sessions. Some disciples begin discussing it amongst themselves, with one saying that they heard the same thing. Another adds that Mujin was really mad at first but calmed down, though his face looked odd. One disciple expresses concern, mentioning that while Mujin might be trying to back down out of kindness, he's still worried, especially knowing the senior disciple's skill level. That night, a group of disciples heads over to Muhoi's house, knocking on the door. When Muhoi answers, they ask if they can talk. He responds with curiosity, noting that if they want to talk away from the others, he's eager to hear what they have to say. He tightens his grip on his wooden sword, ready for whatever may come. One of the disciples is surprised to see Muhoi holding the wooden sword, as it's so unlike him. Musan speaks up, saying that he'll get straight to the point. They want him to take back what he said, explaining that Mujin only backed off from the discussion because he wanted to help preserve Muhoi's image. Muhoi finds this interesting and asks if Mujin sent them. They respond that they came of their own volition. Muhoi nods, still intrigued, but he makes it clear that they have no say in his decisions, and he'll pretend he didn't hear what they said. He suggests they leave. Musan calls out to him, asking him to consider their perspective. He tells Muhoi that it isn't about disliking him. They just want to be taught by someone who is actually skilled. They point out that, right now, Muhoi's skills are subpar, and this is him being greedy, nothing more. Muhoi sighs, acknowledging that Manhwa's hierarchy seems to have degraded. He understands their doubt about his skills, so he'll prove himself to them. He tells them to grab their swords. The disciples ask if he's serious, to which Muhoi replies that he is. He knows how they feel, but if they want to see his skills, they'll have to face him. Musan pulls out his blade, declaring that he asked for this, and charges in, warning Muhoi not to regret it. Muhoi immediately disarms him, slapping his hand, and then striking him in the chest with the hilt of his wooden sword. The force causes Musan to fall to his knees, coughing. Muhoi glares at the others, and Muho tries to join in, but Muhoi smacks him in the head with the sword, causing him to fall as well. Musan, still confused, tells Muhoi that he lost, and Muhoi agrees, adding that now it's time for them to learn a lesson. Muho's leg twitches as Muhoi asks if they're satisfied with the lesson. The disciples confirm, and Muhoi reminds them of what he said would happen if anyone tried to gang up on him. They would beat them as well. They acknowledge that, and Muhoi asks if they still think he's weaker than Mujin. They quickly respond that he's much stronger than him, and when he presses them, they admit that Muhoi is definitely stronger than the other disciples as well. Muhoi looked at the disciples, noticing that they seemed to have learned their lesson. He decided to forget about what had happened, acknowledging that everyone made mistakes. With morning training approaching, he told them to go get some rest. They thanked him for his mercy and left, with Muho being carried away. Muhoi watched them leave and then called out, asking someone how long they planned to stay hidden. He told them to come out, and it was none other than Muchiol, who seemed surprised and asked how Muhoi knew he was there. Muhoi found it amusing that Muchiol had tried to hide, given how large he was, and asked him what he wanted. Muchiol explained that he had just seen Musan and Muho head in this direction. Muhoi was curious and asked who they were, to which Muchiol replied that he had followed them just in case, not expecting Muhoi to win against them. He added that he didn't think he could defeat them. Muchiol then asked if Muhoi had been hiding his true skills all this time. Muhoi reflected on his observations of the second-generation disciples, noting two types: those who kept their distance while still respecting him, and those who secretly looked down on him. Muchiol didn't belong to either group, as he had often helped Muhoi, despite his blunt and indifferent personality. Muhoi thought it had to be because Muchiol was worried about him. When he was younger, Muhoi hadn't understood this, but now he realized that Muchiol's actions were driven by concern. Muchiol had been worried that Muhoi might be gravely injured by Musan and Muho, which was why he had followed them to ensure he would be all right. Muhoi decided to make an excuse and said that he wasn't hiding his skills, but had simply reached a new realm of understanding. Muchiol, seemingly convinced, asked what he meant. Muhoi replied that he would explain it during the morning training and suggested Mu Chiol return for now, since it was still a bit early. Mu Chiol agreed and watched Muhoi head back into his house. As Mu Chiol walked away, he thought about what Muhoi had said, realizing that the move Muhoi had used was the six-fold combo sword technique, a beginner-level technique. However, it had been executed in a way he had never seen before, with such beauty and precision that it made him wonder what Muhoi had truly learned. Mu Chiol, who had always believed Muhoi was weak, found himself amazed at how much Muhoi had changed. For the first time, he felt a genuine excitement about morning training. Muhoi, reflecting on the excuse he had made up on the spot, wondered how he was going to explain himself further. Meanwhile, Mu Ryan asked Mu San and Mu Ho if they really had gotten beaten so easily. They both affirmed, noting that Mu Hoi wasn't the same senior disciple they once knew. He had become a different person. Mu San advised caution, explaining that they couldn't act rashly. Mu Ho, still in disbelief, hoped that Mu Hoi wouldn't turn against them. Mu Ryan dismissed their concerns, saying they were just talking nonsense, and suggested they prepare for morning training. Mu San, carrying Mu Ho once again, reminded them that they would likely face the consequences if they disrespected the senior disciple. As they walked by, Mu Jin, curious about their condition, asked Mu Ryan if something had happened since they both looked terrible and were limping. Mu Ryan downplayed it, saying it was just about Mu Hoi leading the morning training. After a brief explanation, Mu Jin expressed that he understood, but he would have to scold them later. Mu Ryan was puzzled, asking why, and Mu Jin explained that, while he understood that the senior disciple was standing up for himself, it wouldn't be beneficial to act behind his back. He was ashamed of their actions. Mu Ryan, surprised that Mu Jin wasn't taking it well, explained that they were just worried about him. Mu Jin, however, assured him that he understood their concern and would handle it himself. He told them not to worry about it. As they approached the training grounds, Mu Jin's thoughts wandered. He couldn't understand how someone could change so much overnight. He speculated that Mu Hoi had been hiding his skills, but it was still hard to believe that he could have injured Mu San and Mu Ho. Perhaps Mu Chiol had helped him, but Mu Jin knew that the truth would soon be revealed. He would be able to tell if Mu Hoi was bluffing or not by how he led the training. Mu Hoi, now in front of the disciples, began the morning session. He observed that they were all weak and explained that while there were many reasons someone could be strong, there was only one reason for weakness: a lack of the basics. Therefore, starting from that moment, they would focus exclusively on the six-fold combo sword technique during their morning training. The disciples were all taken aback as Mu Hoi spoke, assuring them that he knew they were eager to quickly move past the basics and advance to higher-level techniques. Before he could continue, Mu Ryan interrupted, questioning what was wrong with that. Mu Hoi, stunned by the interruption, couldn't believe it, and even Mu Chiol and Mu Jin turned around in confusion. Mu Ryan persisted, asking what the problem was with wanting to learn faster, and took it upon himself to suggest that if the others couldn't manage, he would. Mu San, realizing how foolish this was, shook his head. Mu Ryan laughed, dismissing the sect's renown as a joke, calling it a mess. Mu Hoi responded, stating that if Mu Ryan had any complaints, he should come up and address him himself. One of the female disciples was surprised, and so was Mu Jin, who began to wonder what the hell Mu Ryan was thinking as he made his way toward Mu Hoi. Mu Ryan smirked, explaining that he understood Mu Hoi's point, but he wasn't sure if it was a good idea to leave the training in his hands, especially if mastering the six-fold combo sword technique was as important as Mu Hoi had claimed. Mu Hoi cut him off, unimpressed, pointing out that Mu Ryan's martial arts were lacking. However, since no one else was willing to step up, he would be the one to prove himself. He asked if that was what Mu Ryan was trying to get at. Mu Ryan was silent for a moment before Mu Hoi added that he hadn't expected everyone to accept him from the start. He then ordered the disciples to pay attention. From now on, he would not take a single step and would use only the six-fold combo sword technique to block Mu Ryan's attacks. If Mu Ryan's wooden sword touched him, or if he took a step back, Mu Ryan would win. And if Mu Ryan succeeded, Mu Hoi would take back his statement about teaching the six-fold combo sword technique and leading the morning training. He locked eyes with Mu Jin as he spoke. Mu Ryan laughed, mocking Mu Hoi's confidence, asking if Mu Hoi thought his victory over Mu San meant something. Mu Hoi didn't respond directly, instead saying that he wasn't sure what Mu Ryan meant, though it did seem like Mu San and Mu Ho had sustained some serious injuries. Ryan jokingly added that Muhoi shouldn't hate him too much if he ended up losing in front of all the disciples. Muhoi, serious, replied that he hoped Ryan wouldn't cross that line. With that, Ryan charged, aiming to strike. Muhoi raised his sword, easily blocking the first attack. Ryan followed with a swift attack from the side, which Muhoi blocked in turn. Ryan then attempted a feint, but it was no more successful. Every move Ryan made was swiftly blocked by Muhoi, leaving the other disciples in stunned silence. As Ryan became more desperate, he began thrusting forward rapidly, trying to land a hit. One of the female disciples recognized the movement as the concentrated wind sword, a technique known for its speed. Muhoi explained that it was the technique Ryan excelled at, and he had even become faster since the last time Muhoi saw him use it. Despite the rapid flurry of strikes, Muhoi blocked every single one with ease. Ryan was clearly frustrated, and Muhoi commented that he needed to use more strength in his shoulders when facing him, as he was stronger than the other second-generation disciples. However, Muhoi also implied that Ryan's skills were still lacking. Ryan, feeling the pressure, began to worry about how to proceed, as he could feel everyone's eyes on him. The disciples murmured among themselves, impressed by Muhoi's performance. They couldn't believe how much stronger he was than they had initially thought. They noted that his feet had not moved an inch, and his balance was impeccable, making it seem like he had become a different person. Mujin, struggling to make sense of what was happening, was in disbelief, unable to comprehend what he was witnessing. Ryan, meanwhile, began to think about what he could do next, realizing that he couldn't recover from this. He had proven the senior disciples' martial arts skills, but not in the way he had hoped. He wondered how Muhoi had improved so much. Muhoi, reading his thoughts, explained that it wasn't about being strong. A sword should be swung with the whole body, and the most important part of swinging a sword was using your feet. If one overlooked the importance of the feet, focusing only on the swing, the sword would be useless. Ryan, still trying to grasp it all, thought about what Muhoi had said. He was beginning to realize that Muhoi was right, but Muhoi, sensing his hesitation, pressed on. He said that Ryan probably didn't fully understand, but deep down Ryan was starting to get it. Muhoi then raised his sword into the air, preparing to demonstrate what it truly meant to swing a sword with the entire body. Ryan, confused, protested, but before he could say anything, Muhoi moved with lightning speed and smacked him with the sword. On the ground, Mujin could hardly believe what had just happened, witnessing the senior disciple had easily subdued Ryan. Muhoi turned to Mu-san and Muho, telling them to come forward and bring Ryan to the Harmony Medicine Palace. They nodded and began running, taking Ryan away. Muhoi looked around at the disciples, asking what they were doing. He told them that they needed to raise their swords. If they didn't, he would take it as a complaint about his method, and they could come up and voice their objections at any time. Seeing that no one had any complaints, they all got into their stances. Muhoi, pleased, declared that it was time to officially begin the morning training. As he did, he noticed that Ryan's blood was still on his face. The morning training session spent on Muhoi instructing the disciples. The scene then shifted to a flashback where Heian asked Hyunjo about his disciple, Muhoi. Heian was perplexed, calling Muhoi the worst of them all and questioning if he possessed any hidden talent that Heian had failed to see. He wondered why Hyunjo had chosen Muhoi as his disciple. Hyunjo, acknowledging that Muhoi was indeed an ordinary kid, explained that he had never seen him give up on anything in his life. Heian then asked if Hyunjo had chosen Muhoi purely because of his determination. Hyunjo agreed, but added that the talented disciples had reached enlightenment on their own. However, to create a martial master out of an ordinary person was the duty of a mentor in the essence of martial arts. The flashback ended, and Muhoi reflected on Hyunjo's words. He admitted that, ideally, he would have picked out only the most talented disciples to train. However, he was no longer the Phantom Swordsman. He was the senior disciple, responsible for leading the second-generation disciples of the Manhwa Sect. He realized that, to fulfill his duty, he had to stick with them until the very end. Muhoi noted that though he had never properly taught the disciples before, he found that having disciples was far more annoying than he had anticipated. He sighed, joking that if they met again after his death, they would have to buy him a really good drink. Muhoi glanced at Mujin, asking if he was already tired, urging him to put more strength into his movements. As Muhoi trained the others, his mind wandered to one of his disciples, wondering how he was doing. He knew he had always focused on bettering himself and never teaching others. He couldn't help but wonder if his disciple was even eating properly, but at least he was confident that his disciple wasn't losing any fights. It would be nice to see him again someday. The scene shifted to Wayan, who had a bandage on his head and was now instructed by Muhoi to properly train their lower bodies using logs as weights. Although it was a rough path that required starting from scratch, Muhoi was confident that, through this trial, the plum flower would blossom. Its scent strong and deep, impossible for anyone to replicate. He too had a long way to go, but his first step in changing the sect was to raise his martial realm. One of the most important aspects of this was sharpening his senses. As the sharper his senses became, the easier it would be to notice small changes in his surroundings, which would naturally improve his martial arts training. Though he hadn't felt much when he first opened his eyes, he could now sense that someone had been watching him. It didn't feel threatening, more like someone was observing him out of curiosity. While he couldn't pinpoint who it was just yet, he was certain that, soon enough, he would be able to tell who they were and where they were. Muhoi continued walking through the Crimson Forest, thinking about his path forward, and made his way to a pavilion. He entered the building, where a man named Hyun-gak greeted him, wondering who had come in. Upon seeing Muhoi, Hyun-gak asked what he needed. Muhoi respectfully greeted Hyun-gak and explained that he had hoped to study the secret techniques. Hyun-gak found this curious, but warned him that his injuries couldn't have fully healed, so he shouldn't overexert himself. Muhoi agreed, acknowledging his caution. Hyun-gak then mentioned that he had heard Muhoi's disciple had been rather rude to him. Muhoi paused, wondering who Hyun-gak was referring to. After thinking for a moment, Muhoi recalled that he had beaten 3 different people recently, but it didn't matter who it was. Hyun-gak apologized, saying it seemed like Mu-san had done something to deserve the beating. He also added that, in his time, Mu-san would have faced even harsher consequences, and he was sorry he hadn't taught him better. Muhoi reassured Hyun-gak, saying it wasn't a big deal. He had just done what he was supposed to as the senior disciple, and Hyun-gak didn't need to worry about it. Hyun-gak was confused, asking if Muhoi had just referred to himself as the senior disciple. He was taken aback and wondered aloud if Muhoi's eyes had always been as sharp as they were now. Muhoi wondered why Hyun-gak was staring at him so intently, questioning whether he had changed his mind about being upset over the way he had beaten his disciple. Hyun-gak, however, simply remarked that Muhoi's eyes were full of determination, noting that it was good to see him taking his role as senior disciple seriously and looking after his martial brothers. He assured Muhoi that he didn't mean to keep him there and that Muhoi was free to go on his way. Hyun-gak then began thinking to himself, reflecting on how Muhoi had lost his master and been left alone but had managed to pull himself together. Hyun-gak felt proud to see Muhoi picking himself up again, filled with determination. He hoped that Hyun-jo could see it from wherever he was. Meanwhile, Muhoi gathered several scrolls and books, placing them on a table to begin reading. As he flipped through each one, he contemplated what the first step in changing the sect should be. The first step, he decided, was to raise his own martial realm. A question lingered: the definition of martial realm. Some might assume it refers to the strength of one's martial arts, but Muhoi explained that this was incorrect. Life and death in the martial world were not determined solely by the strength of one's techniques. No one would fight recklessly when the stakes were life and death. What truly mattered was the ability to utilize the martial arts one had learned, combined with quick, precise judgment and the physical capabilities to back it up. For this reason, a martial realm wasn't just about martial arts. It was the mastery of those arts, along with the wisdom and experience to go with them. That enlightenment came through endless contemplation and reflection. This was the definition of a martial realm that he had created when he was Heian, the Phantom Swordsman, and the best swordsman of the unorthodox faction. It was a truth he had reached after years of training, contemplation, and learning all kinds of secret techniques. The first step in raising his martial realm, Muhoi concluded, was to understand his martial arts fully. However, he acknowledged that he still didn't truly know what the martial arts of manhua were. But he wasn't going to remain ignorant forever. At this point, there were things he was not yet allowed to read. Books forbidden to disciples to prevent those who were too greedy or curious from foolishly attempting to learn higher-level techniques and ruining their key paths. All sects restricted access to their secret techniques, and manhua was no exception. Hyun-jo had once said that manhua was more lenient compared to others, but still, it was a renowned sect with a systematic approach to martial arts, and their techniques were not difficult to understand. Muhoi had already learned the basics, starting with the six-fold combo sword technique, the most fundamental technique. After that, he had mastered 3 more techniques: the concentrated wind sword, the falling plum blossom sword, and the thousand-cent sword. Once one learned these 3 techniques, they would gain access to the plum blossom sword secrets, which were essential for becoming the best martial artist in Manhwa's sect. Only by mastering the plum blossom sword techniques could one use the sect's signature sword techniques: the 7 deadly plum blossom sword, the 3-edged plum blossom sword, and the lucid plum blossom sword. These skills were the foundation of Manhwa's reputation as one of the 3 most renowned swordsmanship sections. It was said that the best swordsman of Manhwa had mastered more than one of the 3 plum blossom swords. Muhoi reflected that the 6-fold combo sword technique was the root, the 3 techniques that followed were the trunk, and the sword's secrets after that were the branches. Finally, the 3 plum blossom swords were the flowers. A martial artist who delved deep into the sword techniques of Manhwa became part of the plum blossom tree, representing the mastery and strength of the sect. At his current level, Muhoi had only reached the trunk. While he was eager to study the branches and beyond, he needed to acquire the plum blossom sword to do so. This sword was given only to those who had proven their martial mastery, and it was a symbol of the sect's highest honor. Muhoi knew he needed to obtain it as soon as possible. Just then, he heard someone approaching. Baekyu, the sect leader, asked if Muhoi truly wished to learn the plum blossom sword secrets. Muhoi immediately greeted Baekyu, who had come to check on him, as it had been a while since anyone had been in the room so late. Baekyu asked if he was allowed to sit with him. Muhoi, politely allowed, realized that the candles had been lit for him, presumably by Hyungak. Baekyu, noting Muhoi's focus, asked if he had really read all the materials before him. Muhoi confirmed that he had. Baekyu, now aware that Muhoi had been leading the 2nd-generation disciples in the morning training, mentioned that he had heard Muhoi was focusing on the 6-fold combo sword technique again. Muhoi looked at Baekyu and confirmed that everything he had said was correct. Baekyu, still curious, asked why Muhoi had chosen the 6-fold combo sword technique specifically. Muhoi, sensing Baekyu's probing, wondered what exactly he was trying to get at. Baekyu inwardly thinking that when Muhoi had first spoken to him before, he had always hesitated to answer him, even to simple questions. Now, Muhoi was doing things he hadn't done before, and he guessed that these were the kinds of things Baekyu was thinking about. He assumed Baekyu just wanted to check on him, to see if he was truly all right or if he was merely pretending to be fine and overexerting himself in the process. He figured that Baekyu was trying to gauge his well-being, wanting to give the answer he expected. Muhoi, in response, stated that the foundation of the sect was the 6-fold combo sword technique. Baekyu, acknowledging this, agreed. But Muhoi continued, explaining that while the foundation was sound, the 2nd-generation disciples had started off on the wrong foot. However, it was kinder to say that they might as well have never started at all. Baekyu, surprised by the bluntness of Muhoi's words, was taken aback. Muhoi thought that this was likely a good answer. After all, the sect leader himself knew how bad the 2nd-generation disciples were. By thinking these thoughts, Muhoi figured that just the fact they were in agreement on the matter would reassure Baekyu. Baekyu, however, was still in disbelief. He thought to himself that Muhoi's state was much worse than he had imagined. He appeared to be truly broken. Baekyu shook his head, realizing that Muhoi's situation might be more severe than anyone had anticipated. Baekyu silently pondered the child before him, trying to reconcile this figure with the Muhoi he once knew. That boy had been innocent, incapable of speaking ill of others, yet now he seemed like someone entirely different. The thoughts settled heavily in his mind. Something had changed him. Perhaps the Black Knight Palace's invasion, the weight of being the sole survivor, or the lingering guilt over the deaths of his master, the elders, and the 1st-generation disciples. Whatever the cause, Baekyu knew one thing with certainty. He needed to make Muhoi understand that none of it had been his fault. Muhoi continued, as though reading Baekyu's thoughts. All 2nd-generation disciples knew that the 6-fold combo sword technique was well within their grasp, something they had learned early on at the Manhwa sect. But despite their years of practice, their skill with the technique had deteriorated, a result of years spent training without focus. Baekyu listened closely as Muhoi elaborated. The martial arts of different sects and clans in the Jianghu were shaped by their distinct ideologies. These philosophies were embedded in their martial arts, making them more than just techniques. Muhoi went on to explain how each sect's martial school expressed its ideology. He mentioned Wudong's Taiji Fist, Diansong's Sun-Shattering Sword, and Qingqing's Azure Cloud Crimson Dawn Slash, all as examples of how martial arts techniques were a direct reflection of the ideologies of the sects. As Muhoi spoke, he considered his words carefully. To truly master a martial school's technique was not merely to practice the physical moves, but to understand and internalize the ideology behind them. It wasn't about perfecting a form. It was about embodying the philosophy the martial school represented. Muhoi's calm, precise explanation reminded Baekyu of Hyunjo. Despite Muhoi's apparent detachment, Baekyu couldn't shake the feeling that his words were steeped in a depth and conviction reminiscent of his former disciple. Muhoi then concluded that the second-generation disciples had become overly focused on perfecting the plum flower, an ideal that distracted them from the true purpose of martial training. He explained that it wasn't about forcing the plum flower to bloom, but letting it happen naturally through the process of training and understanding the ideology behind their martial arts. Baekyu nodded in agreement, impressed by the depth of Muhoi's understanding. The blossoming of the plum flower would come naturally through focused training, not through artificial attempts to make it happen. Muhoi then shared his plans to continue guiding the disciples in their training with the six-fold combo sword technique. However, Baekyu shifted his question, making it clear he wasn't asking about the disciples. He wanted to know about Muhoi's path, the one he intended to follow for himself. Muhoi paused before answering, thinking carefully. He admitted that while he had great respect for the Manhwa sect's martial arts, there were aspects that he found lacking, especially from the perspective of someone who had always prioritized efficiency for survival. His thoughts wandered further. If his own path no longer aligned with Manhwa's principles, it meant stepping beyond the sect's will, a thought that settled uneasily within him. But despite his internal conflict, Muhoi offered an answer that would satisfy Baekyu's concerns. He intended to fulfill his master's wishes, to walk the same path his master had, and surpass him. That was the duty of a disciple, after all. However, deep down, Muhoi knew he wanted the freedom to do as he pleased, even if it meant giving Baekyu an answer he was expected to hear. Baekyu's realization struck him. It wasn't Muhoi's talent that reminded him of Hyunjo. It was his intent to carry on Hyunjo's will. The road ahead would be difficult. Creating new techniques was no small task, but there was something about Muhoi's resolve that intrigued him. Baekyu's pride in Muhoi swelled, and he laughed heartily, expressing his happiness at seeing his growth. He was sure that Hyunjo, wherever he was, would be proud as well. Muhoi simply acknowledged the praise, quietly thanking him. Baekyu smiled contentedly as he thought back to the plum blossoms that had bloomed amidst the snow. Despite their delicate nature, the plum flowers had endured the harshest cold to bloom more intensely than ever. He thought of the ones he had failed to protect on Manhwa. He should have been the one to fall, not them. Even though the plum flowers had fallen, a small bud remained beside them. His thoughts deepened further. His duty now was to nurture that bud and help it bloom. He gazed out the window, watching the moonlight illuminate the night, his resolve firming with every passing moment. He turned back to Muhoi. There were many flowers on Manhwa, not just the plum flowers, Baekyu remarked. Muhoi, curious, asked why the plum flowers had been chosen. Baekyu smiled faintly, encouraging him to think about it. There were lessons to be learned, and Muhoi would understand in time. Baekyu then realized the conversation had gone on long enough. He stood, apologizing for keeping Muhoi so long. As he made his way, he remembered something important. He turned to Muhoi, mentioning that there was something he had meant to tell him before he left. Baekyu, reflecting on his own experience, expressed that though he, too, had lost his master, he couldn't claim to fully understand the depth of Muhoi's sadness. He acknowledged that everyone experiences emotions differently. He continued, explaining that life and death were one, an inevitable cycle where the end of something marked the beginning of something new. It was a natural flow of things. Instead of viewing Hyunjo's death as an ending, Baekyu advised Muhoi to see it as a new beginning and to think of his actions as a way of celebrating Hyunjo's life. This shift in perspective, he believed, could help ease the grief. He was sure Hyunjo would have wanted Muhoi to think this way. Muhoi reflected on the idea of celebrating his master's life. It didn't sound bad at all. He thanked Baekyu for his wisdom, genuinely appreciating the advice. The wisdom reminded Muhoi of a past memory with his senior when he was Dako Hien. The senior had once commented on his fragility and how he had been young and impetuous then. Hien had been blunt in his response, asking if the senior wanted to die. He had called Hien arrogant and rash, but had added that those very qualities were perfect for training the body. The senior had then proposed a new way to train, something Heian hadn't forgotten. Now Muhoi was using that very training method. Tying 3 massive logs together, he lifted them using his legs, holding onto a tree branch as he lifted his leg high to train his lower body. The less trained the body, the more effective this method was. Muhoi thought back to the eccentric old man, the Iron Mountain Fist King. The training method was certainly a brute force approach, but it worked. He hadn't expected that connection to come in handy like this. As Muhoi lost himself in thought, a female disciple approached him, calling out to him. It wasn't the time to be training, she said. Muhoi was briefly confused, unsure of what she meant. Brimming with excitements, she explained that the sect leader had ordered him to make a trip down the mountain. The morning had been spent discussing the concerns surrounding the third-generation disciples, and it was already late, so they had to prepare immediately. One of the elders spoke up, noting that they should have taken in third-generation disciples by now, but the Shanxi massacre had delayed their efforts. Baekyu added that they should also consider bringing in disciples from the outer sects, so others would know they were still doing well despite the setbacks. One elder agreed, and Baekyu confirmed the suggestion, seeing the need to reassure everyone. Baekjin raised a question about sending someone to check on the Shanxi outer sect, knowing that an unorthodox alliance or some other evil organization might be eyeing the power vacuum left behind. Baekyu agreed that this couldn't be ignored any longer. He considered how martial halls set up outside the main sect would attract new disciples eager to learn Manhwa's martial arts. The massacre had weakened their forces, and the Shanxi outer sect had taken the hardest hit. As they deliberated on who to send, one elder raised a concern about who would go. Baekyu, however, suggested sending a second-generation disciple to give them a real taste of the Jianghu. The elders were hesitant, worried about how unstable the outside world still was. Baekyu suggested sending a few of the most talented disciples, and the idea quickly turned to the 3 flowers. Baekjin sought clarification, asking if Baekyu meant the 3 best disciples. Baekyu then proposed sending Muhoi as well, certain that Muhoi would have no problem dealing with the outside world. At first, Baekjin agreed, but then, in surprise, realized that the sect leader had proposed Muhoi for the task. One elder expressed concern about sending Muhoi, especially since he had changed a lot in the past month. Baekyu responded calmly, assuring them with a weary yet calming smile that Muhoi would be fine. Thus, Muhoi was sent out to see the outside world, and the scene shifted to Pasang City. Muhoi led 3 other disciples in accordance with the sect leader's orders. The town was small and unremarkable, with little to draw attention except for a simple establishment that sold drinks. Muhoi couldn't help but think to himself about how mundane the place seemed. However, Muhwa, his fellow disciple, was completely distracted by the sight of a braised chicken, mesmerized by how delicious it looked. She excitedly asked her senior to look at it. Mujin, ever the voice of reason, reminded her that they were wearing the Manhwa sect's uniform and needed to behave accordingly. Muhwa acknowledged him, but her attention quickly shifted to the scent of lamb meat a few steps away. Mujin had to call her out again. Muhwa, still distracted by the smell of the food, insisted that they look at it, her hunger apparent. Muhoi noticed her distraction, but before he could comment, Muhwa bumped into a thug on the street. Surprised, Muhwa turned to face the man she had bumped into. The thug stared back at her, and the 4 disciples stood there awkwardly, with Muhwa still startled by the encounter. Mujin immediately urged her to apologize, but before he could finish his words, Muhoi raised a hand to stop him. The thug, sizing them up, asked if they were second-generation disciples of the Manhwa sect. He remarked that it must have been their first time in the Jianghu and wondered if Manhwa sect didn't know how to ask for forgiveness. Muhwa, still confused, wondered aloud about the thug's words. He went on to say that she should be the one to apologize as she had bumped into him first. The thugs pressed the issue, making it clear they believed Muhwa was at fault. Muhoi, assessing the situation, realized the thugs must be from some criminal organization, given their appearance. He thought that they had likely taken advantage of the power vacuum left by the Shanxi outer sect. Despite the setback from the massacre, Muhoi felt that Manhwa was not so weak as to allow lowlifes like them to push them around. It was clear that someone influential was backing these thugs. Muhoi didn't know who, but he wasn't concerned with that. His focus shifted to how this situation would be a valuable experience for the younger disciples. Meanwhile, the thug in the green robe seemed to be fixated on Muhwa's chest, his gaze unwavering as she continued to argue with his companion. Without warning, Muhoi drew his sword and pointed it at the thug's eyes, asking where he thought he was looking. This caught the thug off guard, and Manhwa was startled by the sudden tension. Muhoi explained that he had known from the beginning that the thug was the one who had bumped into her, and he had been waiting to see how the situation would unfold. He had seen the thug's arrogance and was now certain that the thug had crossed the line. He warned them that they had just started a fight with the Manhwa Sect. Muhoi conveyed an understanding of how the Jianghu underworld perceived the Manhwa Sect. The thug's mind raced in response. It was clear that their origins had been uncovered. A silent curse formed in his thoughts as he struggled to comprehend how this realization had come about. Regardless of the method, action was necessary. With urgency, he acknowledged the mistake and sought to rectify it, offering an apology, but Muhoi rejected the apology, unwilling to accept anything from such scum. With a cold, commanding tone, he told them to leave immediately if they didn't want to risk one of them losing an eye. The thugs, fearing that Muhoi would follow through with his threat, fled in haste. Manhwa, still rattled, apologized to Muhoi, but he reassured her, telling her that the thug was in the wrong, not her. Muchiol remarked that those from the underworld must be far worse than they had imagined. Muhoi, sensing the tension, suggested that they find an inn and get something to eat first. This idea brought joy to Manhwa, whose attention was immediately drawn to the food she spotted. On the other hand, Mujin remained deep in thought. Mujin reflected on the situation. They had been the ones who had picked the fight, yet he had rushed to tell Manhwa to apologize without even realizing that. He had been focused on being careful with their behavior, considering they were representing the Manhwa Sect. But he had failed to recognize the need to address those who had dared to look down on the sect. As Mujin pondered, he realized that Muhoi had already understood the situation. His senior was aware of his surroundings at all times and had reacted as though he was used to handling such things. Mujin, now steeling himself, thought that he would never allow anyone to look down on Manhwa Sect again. Meanwhile, Muhoi regretted not dealing with the thugs more directly, by simply killing them in that moment, but his focus remained on the task at hand. Soon, they arrived at an inn, seated themselves, and prepared to order. When they were done, a mountain of bowls was piled up on the table. Muhoi, looking at the pile of bowls, teased them, wondering if they had been lazing around with their training since it seemed like she was eating less than usual. Manhwa, quick to defend herself, assured him that she wasn't slacking off. Muchiol chimed in, suggesting that Muhoi simply ate more now. Right after, Manhwa expressed her frustration. It would have been much easier if the sect leader had been more specific with their mission or goal. His instructions had been too vague, leaving them uncertain about what to do next. Muhoi tried to offer some direction. He spoke if anything noteworthy had happened during the day. Manhwa, still thinking, racked her brain, trying to recall anything important. Some people had picked a fight with them. They had reserved rooms, and then they had eaten. Her thoughts finally led her to the underworld. It clicked in her mind, and she realized the significance of the encounter. Muhoi then clarified their situation. The sect leader had given them his full trust to make their own decisions. He was considering teaching a lesson to those from the underworld, though he stopped short of saying it outright, instead suggesting they deal with them. He turned to his fellow disciples, asking what they wanted to do. That night, the 3 second-generation disciples decided that their first course of action would be to gather information. Muhoi, donning a cloak, moved through the night, keeping to the shadows as he witnessed a group of random thugs harassing a young woman. In the dark alleyway, the man from the underworlds placed his arm on the woman, trying to convince her that they were the only ones who asked so little. The term underworlds referred to those who committed immoral acts based on incorrect beliefs or thoughts. While the word might evoke images of demonic forces, like the Black Knight Palace, there was a distinct difference between the underworlds and the various martial artists within the unorthodox, including the demonic forces. The woman trembled in fear as a bald man spoke to her, trying to exclaim something. He mentioned that the calculations were off and pointed out that the interest rate had recently increased, but they had overlooked it. The woman was confused, and the bald man explained that it was only right to collect the money at once. However, since the mistake was his, he suggested that instead of money, she pay with something else. His gaze lingered on her bosom as he spoke. The difference between the underworlds and the various martial artists within the unorthodox was in their goals. The underworlds sought money, pleasure, or the cheap thrill of dominion over the weak. Organizations that killed for money could also be considered underworlds, though they were usually just called assassins. In contrast, the underworld were often seen as thugs and ruffians, living dirty lives and never aspiring to become anything more. However, Muhoi had not expected them to start a fight upon seeing a disciple from Manhwa. He joined the conversation, calling the man either arrogant or ignorant, though he couldn't fully comprehend their behavior. The thugs turned to him and asked who he was. They complained about being told to stand watch by the bastard Yungbong, who was nowhere to be found. They assumed Yungbong had grown impatient and wandered off like a bum. Muhoi demanded to know who they thought they were to act in such a manner, questioning if they had some backing. The thugs were confused, thinking Muhoi was looking for a fight. They threatened him, saying that if he didn't want to get messed up, he should just leave. Muhoi had other intentions, though. He had come to find them for a different reason. The man told Muhoi to leave, but the bald man kept his arm on the woman's shoulder, suggesting they continue what they had started. Before the bald man could finish his sentence, Muhoi's knee struck the other man's face, sending him flying backward. The bald man was left dumbfounded. Muhoi approached the man on the ground and kicked him again, knocking him unconscious. With the bald man now stunned, the woman escaped his grasp. Muhoi called the bald man a pig, to which the bald man meekly replied with respectful affirmation. Muhoi noticed that the men had learned some third-rate martial arts and suggested that the bald man approach him with killing intent. At the very least, that would give him a chance to live. He then ordered the man to hand over his wallet. A few moments later, a man was groggily urinating on a tree when the men at the table called to him, teasing him about pissing all day. One man complained that he'd sober up at that rate. The old man responded, saying that the other man would be coming soon. The groggy man grumbled, having failed to notice the men tied to the branches of a tree. He returned to the table and asked why the other man was rushing to drink. The man explained that he had seen something interesting and wanted to share it. He pointed to the next table, where someone had ordered an enormous amount of food, about 3 bundles worth. However, he was confused because the person was no longer there. He insisted that a man in a cape had been there just moments ago, ordering food to go. Even at night, the streets bustled with people. Muhwa was deep in conversation with a merchant, while Mu Chiol secretly followed some men. Mujin, meanwhile, was drinking and eavesdropping but remained focused on his task. In a slum area of the city, the smell of pork belly and spring rolls filled the air. One man commented that he didn't know where the bastard had been rolling around eating, but found it ridiculous that he brought food in front of them. The crowd, unable to resist, decided to go after the man to grab the food. However, Muhoi drew his sword, pointing it at them. He told them that he wasn't there to share, and that if they dared touch his food, he would cut their heads off. A man stepped forward and, with a respectful tone, said that the young master was impressive. He introduced himself as Jingi of the Beggar Sect. Muhoi sheathed his sword and introduced himself in turn. Jingi expressed regret that the Beggar Sect could not be of help during the Shangxi massacre, also acknowledging the shame of the incident with the Manhwa sword saint. Muhoi responded that it was fine and expressed sympathy, understanding that the aftermath of the Shangxi massacre must have been difficult, especially because of the extreme heavenly sect. Jingi acknowledged Muhoi's knowledge and then asked what had brought him to the Beggar Sect. Muhoi replied that he wanted to learn more about the underworlders that were currently controlling Pasong. He noted that food would lose its taste once it became cold and suggested they speak while eating. Jingi was amused and took a bite, while Muhoi learned that the underworld bastards were from the brutal blood faction. They had taken control of the power vacuum left behind by Hua Ryu, Mount Hua's outer sect, which had been annihilated during the Shangxi massacre. Muhoi was surprised by the strength of these underworld men and asked if it was typical for them to be so capable. Jingi explained that everyone in the brutal blood faction was somewhat knowledgeable in martial arts. Muhoi agreed, as he had already encountered a few of them and had noticed that they seemed to have learned third-rate martial arts. Shifting the conversation, Muhoi reminded Jingi that they hadn't yet discussed what truly mattered. Jingi asked what he meant, and Muhoi revealed that he was referring to the mastermind behind the brutal blood faction. Jingi asked why Muhoi believed there was a mastermind behind the faction, and Muhoi explained that while Pasong wasn't a particularly large area, it wasn't small either. The Huaryu sect was quite large for a small to mid-sized sect, and Pasong, being relatively big among smaller places, seemed an unlikely target for a mere underworld organization to monopolize. The power vacuum there would naturally attract interest, and it seemed odd for a single underworld faction to control the area completely. Muhoi explained that it wouldn't be surprising if dozens of underworld groups controlled different parts of Pasong, competing against one another. Jingi complimented Muhoi's discernment, noting how it was hard to see him as a mere rising prospect in Jianghu. He then explained that he hadn't brought it up earlier because he wasn't yet certain, but now that Muhoi had voiced his thoughts, he could share what he knew. Clearing his throat, Jingi told Muhoi not to be surprised. He revealed that there was a martial artist who was frequently in contact with the Brutal Blood faction, and that they were from the Nine Hellsword Sect. The Nine Hellsword Sect was one of Shangshi's 3 big sects, ranking alongside 2 of the 10 largest sections. Despite their size, the Nine Hellsword Sect had never paid much attention to the Manhwa or Zhongnan sects. This nonchalance and their larger scale made them formidable. Muhoi found it strange that the Nine Hellsword Sect would be involved. If they were behind the Brutal Blood faction, they would have flaunted their ambitions. But he questioned whether they had the time and ability to focus on an area like Pasong. Jingi clarified that he wasn't certain the mastermind was from the Nine Hellsword Sect. If they were involved, they wouldn't have cared about appearances and would have caused a ruckus. Muhoi understood there was no concrete evidence, but he still doubted the Nine Hellsword Sect's involvement. Jingi praised his insight, and Muhoi, now more curious, asked who this martial artist might be. Jingi seemed to have forgotten to mention the name, and then revealed that he suspected the martial artist was the Red Wolf Sword from the Nine Hellsword Sect. Muhoi was taken aback and clarified, asking if Jingi had just mentioned the Red Wolf Sword. Jingi confirmed and, seeing Muhoi's reaction, noted that it would have been strange if he hadn't heard of the name. He cautioned Muhoi to be careful of whatever plans the Red Wolf Sword might be orchestrating. Muhoi was deep in thought, as he had never heard of the Red Wolf Sword before. At dawn, Muhoi gazed into the distance, hoping to gather intelligence on the Red Wolf Sword, but he had no success. That night, he continued to accompany Jingi, sharing drinks with him, even if only tea. His plan was to play along for a while and wait for Jingi to open up about the Red Wolf Sword. He intended to drink just enough to coax information from him, but he hadn't accounted for one important detail, which was the drink tasted so good. Jingi noticed Muhoi's enjoyment and remarked that it seemed to be to his liking. Muhoi agreed, saying it had been so long since he'd tasted something so fine. Jingi seemed puzzled, as he thought this was Muhoi's first time in Jianghu. Muhoi kept drinking, though the beggars knocked themselves out too soon, leaving him unable to drink as much as he wanted. He didn't get the information he sought, but it was fine, since he already had some assumptions about the situation. Even so, he still wondered what choices the underworld men would make. With some time left, Muhoi decided to enjoy the leftover wine. As night fell, Mu Chiol seemed bothered by a smell, and Muhwa had an idea that it was alcohol. Muhoi then spoke up, asking the 3 disciples what they had learned. Muhwa spotted bottles hidden beneath Muhoi's bed and couldn't help but ask if he had been sitting there drinking while they were out gathering information. Muhoi responded that he had not been drinking. Muhwa pressed further, and Muhoi stood his ground, insisting that he wouldn't repeat himself. He told them to share what they had learned. Mujin spoke first, reporting that the underworlders had taken over the power vacuum left by Manhwa's outer sect and now controlled Pasong. Muhwa added that the underworld men were a group of evil bastards, dining and dashing, stealing from civilians, and resorting to violence when the people didn't cooperate. It was apparently common for them to beat someone to death. Mu Chiol then spoke up, informing Muhoi that the biggest problem with these men was that they had learned martial arts. While it was only third-rate martial arts, it was still dangerous when used against civilians who hadn't studied martial arts themselves. Muhoi praised them for their quick work, considering the little time they had to gather information. Now, it was his turn to share what he had learned. He was certain that the 3 disciples had already cross-checked their findings, but he reaffirmed that the information was true. However, there was something they should be skeptical about, which is how the men had learned martial arts. Muhoi explained that it wasn't that hard to learn third-rate martial arts, and books on such techniques were easy to obtain. But these men were the type to never touch a book unless it was to burn it. He doubted that all of them had learned martial arts from a book. It seemed unlikely, and someone must have helped them. Muhoi had looked into who might have assisted them, but although he found out who it was, he couldn't uncover the reason behind it. Mujin asked who it was, and Muhoi fell silent for a moment before revealing that it was the Red Wolf sword from the Nine Hellsword Sect. Hearing this, the three disciples were shocked. Mujin was surprised to learn that it wasn't just a group of lowly criminals they were dealing with. Muhoi, thinking of ambushing the underworlders and wiping them out, asked what they thought of that plan. The three were once again surprised. Mujin wondered if Muhoi was serious, considering the men were tied to the Nine Hellsword Sect. Muchiol spoke up, saying he had no idea why the Nine Hellsword Sect would work with a criminal group, but he didn't think it was something they should decide on their own. He suggested that it would be best to report to the elders before making any decisions. Mujin silently cheered for Muchiol as he shared the same opinion. Muhoi simply questioning the suggestion. Manhwa expressed agreement with Muchiol's stance, adding that they needed to stand up against the injustice. Muhoi was amused, while Mujin was internally disagreed. To Mujin, the situation in Manhwa was already overwhelming, recovering from the Shanxi massacre. If they clashed with a large sect like the Nine Hellsword Sect, it could spell disaster for them. Mujin wanted to avoid that at all costs. Finally, Mujin spoke, expressing his concerns that it would be too dangerous. He explained that while it would be fine if they were just dealing with the underworlders, if the Nine Hellsword Sect was indeed behind them, they might be starting a war. Muhoi assured him that he was jumping to conclusions, but he understood Mujin's concerns. He reassured him that such a conflict wouldn't happen. Mujin asked how Muhoi could be so certain, and Muhoi explained that the Nine Hellsword Sect didn't operate like that. He mentioned that the Nine Hellsword Sect was a tyrannical organization, and if they wanted to eliminate a group, they wouldn't go behind the scenes. They would simply start a fight. Muhoi also pointed out that with Manhwa's current situation, the Nine Hellsword Sect could invade and wipe them out at any time if they wanted. However, Muhoi believed that the Nine Hellsword Sect wouldn't have the time or resources to deal with such matters right now. Mujin was still confused, but Muhoi concluded that the underworlds were not truly connected to the Nine Hellsword Sect. Even if they were, he didn't believe the Nine Hellsword Sect would initiate a war with Manhwa. Once Muhoi had finished explaining, he told them that they would be leaving. Mujin panicked and asked where Muhoi had gotten this information from, and if it was trustworthy. Muhoi simply with a word of affirmation and revealed that he had gotten the information from the Beggar Sect. Mujin was dumbfounded. The Beggar Sect, for what he knew, was an orthodox organization composed of beggars. Any beggar in Murim could be considered a part of the sect, and in terms of numbers, no organization in Murim could match them. The Beggar Sect used their numerical advantage to gather intelligence, earning money and food by trading information. One should never underestimate them just because they were beggars, because they had learned martial arts and followed their own morals and ethics. Therefore, any information from this organization was definitely trustworthy. Before they departed, Muhoi told Mujin not to worry too much. He admitted that he had expressed an intention to kill them, but that didn't mean he wouldn't first try to be peaceful. Mujin convinced himself that he had been overthinking things. He decided to stop worrying since his senior disciple had assured him that things would be worked out. He willed himself to calm down. Muhoi instructed them to get ready, as they had already arrived. Mujin had no idea what Muhoi would say to the underworlders, but he knew it would be obvious if he seemed too anxious. He didn't want to be a burden. To his surprise, Muhoi kicked the door, shattering it. He then questioned aloud where the piece had gone. The underworld men wondered when they saw the gate broken down and demanded to know who the intruders were. Muhoi casually stated that it was nice to see them all gathered there. He told the men to relay a message to the Red Wolf Sword and their leader, demanding that they show up and kneel in apology. If they did, Muhoi announced that he would spare their lives. As he spoke, he unsheathed his sword, signaling that things were about to escalate. The men stood there, confused, until one underworld member recognized the symbol. Realization dawned on them, and they understood that the intruders were from Manhwa. Mujin scowled and informed his senior disciple that he didn't think this was a peaceful method. Muhoi asked what they meant and told them to remember that breaking down the gates was a common approach when ambushing another sect or clan in the Jianghu. Just then, someone from inside the building stormed out, demanding to know what the ruckus was about. A man reported to his leader that the intruders might be from the Manhwa sect. The leader stopped in his tracks, eyeing the group carefully. He thought to himself that they were just a bunch of kids, only 4 of them, and wondered if these kids were really so confident just because they came from Manhwa. He finally spoke, asking them if they wanted to die for ambushing them so late at night. The leader decided to let it go for now because they had an important guest. He told the intruders to leave if they didn't want to die. Muhoi responded that it was actually they who would die and advised the man to watch his tone, as Muhoi didn't like how he spoke. The man was dumbfounded, wondering if this kid was out of his mind. He warned that while he might not know who they were involved with, he saw the kid clearly didn't value his life. The leader told his men to show these newbies how terrifying Jianghu could be, but ordered them not to kill the intruders. The men drew their swords, but the 4 kids from Manhwa remained calm. Muhoi noticed something that made her expression turn grim. She saw 2 corpses at the back, a man and a woman, both covered in blood. Her anger surged as she moved toward them. The 3 men were surprised by her sudden action. Muhoi knelt by the bodies to check them over. The man had died with his eyes wide open, and the woman was gravely injured. Mu Chiol and Mu Jin rushed to her side, yelling for her to be careful with the men in front of her. They raised their swords at her, but Muhoi, now enraged, swiftly attacked using the bamboo leaf hand technique. The men were thrown back, groaning in pain as they crashed to the ground. Mu Jin and Mu Chiol positioned themselves to cover her back. Mu Jin scolded her for acting on her own, but Muhoi was determined. She announced that the bodies weren't in a good state and needed to be taken to a physician immediately. The bald man, whom Muhoi had attacked, retorted, asking who says they can take them. He then stated that while they might be from Manhwa, they were weak. He told the underworld men to get them if they could, provided they all fought together. The leader watched the exchange, and Muhoi observed that while Muhoi had used less force than usual, it seemed like she was controlling her strength as she did during training. He commented that she was being too soft, then asked if her sword was just for decoration. He pressed her, asking why she hesitated when the men were clearly trying to kill her. He urged her to stab them without further hesitation. The leader, watching Muhoi remain unfazed as his fellow disciple rushed to help Muhoi, concluded that this kid must be confident in his skills. He decided not to confront Muhoi directly, but instructed his men to take care of the others and deal with the kid later with numbers. Muhoi observed this, confused about the leader's behavior. He wondered why the man was running toward the other underworld men instead of dealing with him directly. But it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Muhoi realized that this was the situation he had been hoping for. The 3 disciples were inexperienced in the Jianghu, having only recently joined the underworlds, so they weren't fully aware of what they were up against. Mu Jin, however, was surprised when dirt was suddenly thrown into his face. A kick to the stomach followed, and Muhoi knew that these men often threw dirt and even spat at their opponents. He was sure the 3 disciples are taken aback by having to fight enemies who were doing whatever it took to try and kill them. It was different from the incident with the Black Knight Palace when the first-generation disciples had been there to protect them. Now, they would die if they didn't take their opponents down themselves. Mu Jin was on the ground when a sword was swung above him. He did his best to block it with his own sword. Muhoi knew that these 3 needed to learn that in the Jianghu, life and death weren't determined solely by martial prowess. The training they had received up in the mountains, where they merely took turns attacking each other, was far from the reality of what they now faced. It seemed different for Mu Chiol, though. He was calm and didn't hesitate to defeat his opponents. A bald man with a sword rushed toward him. Dropping the man he was holding, the bald man swung his sword, but Mu Chiol grabbed his hand to stop it. With a powerful punch, the bald man fell unconscious. Mu Chiol's eyes were determined, like a beast in battle. When the leader saw this, he rushed back to Muhoi. He noticed him and remarked that he was wrong. It seemed that the leader thought he could take down the weaker ones first, then team up with the others to deal with the stronger ones. Before the leader could do anything, however, he was buried waist-deep, upside down on the ground. The men saw their leader down and panicked, unsure of what to do, especially now that their opponents seemed far stronger. A long-haired man suddenly appeared and said they could simply pick one of them to fight. He announced that anyone who could kill a Manhwa disciple would be given the leader's position. He told the men to stop being dramatic and finish their job. The disciples recognized this man as the Red Wolf Sword, and Muhoi couldn't help but express that he had been wondering when this man would finally show himself. The Red Wolf Sword seemed amused that they knew him. He said it was an honor for a young disciple of the Manhwa Sect to recognize him. But Muhoi replied that he had only just learned of him the day before. He insulted the man, saying he didn't care to learn the names of weaklings. The Red Wolf Sword scoffed, stating that a manhua disciple should follow orthodox ways. Yet here was this kid, speaking like a demonic martial artist. He warned Muhoi that if he wanted to continue this path, the Red Wolf Sword would make him regret it. The Red Wolf Sword dropped his cup and jumped down from the building, unsheathing his weapon as he prepared for battle. He told Muhoi that he would need to give it his all. Muhoi simply replied that he wasn't sure if that was necessary and challenged the Red Wolf Sword, asking if he was strong enough to handle it. In an instant, Muhoi passed by the Red Wolf Sword, and the man covered his ear, stunned by how quickly Muhoi moved. Before he could react, Muhoi smacked him on the head, sending him face first to the ground. The Red Wolf Sword used the scabbard of his sword to help himself up, then performed a maneuver and landed on his feet. He was surprised by the kid's speed. He realized that he hadn't just missed the movements. On top of that, he hadn't even seen Muhoi's feet move. The Red Wolf Sword watched him closely, now wondering why Muhoi wasn't using his sword. The Red Wolf Sword refused to believe that a young kid like this could be at a higher level than him. He thought there had to be something more to Muhoi, but still, there was no special reason why he wasn't killing the old man. He simply wanted to see his swordsmanship against another martial artist. It had been a month since Muhoi had respawned in his new body, and he hadn't missed a single day of training. His research into combining Manhwa's martial arts with his techniques was continued. However, he couldn't prove the results of his work yet, as the disciples weren't strong enough to see the difference, and neither the elders nor the first-generation disciples had time for him. That was why the Red Wolf Sword was valuable to Muhoi. The Red Wolf Sword attacked again, but Muhoi simply stepped aside to avoid the strike. Then, with open palms, he used the bamboo leaf hand technique. The Red Wolf Sword flew backward, but Muhoi wasn't done. He struck the old man with his sword, sending him reeling. The Red Wolf Sword was dumbfounded. He wondered if Muhoi had read his movements. After all, for a kid to be at the level where he could follow someone's steps with such subtlety, it had to be due to a huge difference in their levels. The Red Wolf Sword refused to believe it, but after a brief moment, he acknowledged that the kid wasn't just a talented young prospect. He apologized for underestimating him and decided to go all out. He rushed toward Muhoi with renewed resolve. Muhoi noticed something approaching, as if a large golden mystic beast charged toward him. The three young disciples turned, worried for their senior disciple, looked on with concern as they prepared for what was to come. Muhoi gripped his sword and slashed at the beast using the falling plum blossom sword technique. The beast vanished into thin air. He remarked that the red bud sword technique was fierce, but had many gaps, noting that based on Red Wolf Sword's movements, he hadn't even fully mastered it. Red Wolf Sword was surprised that Muhoi knew about the red bud sword technique. He asked how Muhoi had learned of it, but before he could get an answer, Muhoi charged forward. Red Wolf Sword barely saw him coming and was momentarily confused, thinking he had blocked the attack. He initially considered that it might be an illusionary sword attack, but then he doubted that, although perhaps it was the rapid sword technique. In the blink of an eye, Muhoi's slash passed through him. He didn't even have time to realize it before his blood began dripping onto the ground. Everyone was stunned. Not only had blood spilled, but Red Wolf Sword's long hair was cut, leaving only bangs on his left side. The attack also had cuts on his cheek and ear. Red Wolf Sword realized that in that brief moment, Muhoi had purposely shifted his sword to avoid killing him. He understood that Muhoi could have killed him easily, but had chosen not to. This realization made him wonder why Muhoi had shown such restraint. He thought back to how Muhoi had stayed behind him, never using his sword to strike directly. It was as though Muhoi was going easy on him, and he couldn't understand why. Red Wolf Sword, feeling a surge of frustration, acknowledged that Muhoi's talent was undeniable. He thought about how Muhoi seemed to be the same person he had in his mind, someone with immense potential. He cursed the meaning of talent, feeling resentful that Muhoi was better than him, especially since he had lived at least twice as long as this young man. He cursed Muhoi and warned him not to look down on him. He claimed he was a martial artist of the 9 Hellsword Sect and released 3 golden beasts, all of which charged straight for Muhoi. Muhoi swung his sword, and in a single movement, the beasts vanished. Moments later, Red Wolf Sword was struck by something resembling wind blades. Muhoi, watching in awe, recognized the move. Red Wolf Sword bled from several wounds, his body shaking with disbelief. He thought about how he had trained continuously since the kid, not even born, perfecting his martial arts so that his skills would be acknowledged. He questioned how this young man could destroy the results of his decades of effort so easily. He couldn't understand why he couldn't follow Muhoi's movements or even cut him. In a moment of frustration, Red Wolf Sword screamed, wondering why his efforts weren't being recognized. Muhoi, unfazed, simply cut him down further. The man who had been buried earlier by Muhoi regained consciousness, lifting his head from the hole. He coughed and spit out dirt, complaining about the pain in his head. He remembered brandishing his sword just before everything went black, then heard Red Wolf Sword's frustrated cries about his efforts being unacknowledged. Glancing behind him, he was shocked to see Red Wolf Sword stood, right at the moment Muhoi struck him. Red Wolf Sword kept thinking that there was nothing more unfair than talent. His efforts had been trumped by the innate abilities of a young prospect. The young man had only trained for a few years at best, yet he had already surpassed him. Even though Red Wolf Sword was on the ground, bleeding from his shoulder, he muttered bitterly about the young prospect and the martial artist from the Nine Hell Sword Sect. He chuckled, acknowledging that it must be nice for Muhoi to have the talent to surpass him. Muhoi was confused by the man's words, but didn't waste time pondering them. Red Wolf Sword continued, saying that he had seen many talented and young martial artists and could tell that Muhoi had grown used to being praised by those around him. He added that it must be nice to cut him down and gain honor from it. Red Wolf Sword warned Muhoi to enjoy it while he could, because once the Nine Hell Sword Sect confirmed his death, it would only be a matter of time before he met the same fate. No matter how talented Muhoi was, he could never stand against the Nine Hell Sword Sect. Muhoi commented dryly that for someone about to die, Red Wolf Sword sure had a lot to say. He kicked Red Wolf Sword, knocking him onto his back, then noted how the man had spoken with a tone of inferiority. As Muhoi looked closely, he noticed something. Letters were inscribed on Red Wolf Sword's chest. Muhoi realized that Red Wolf Sword was part of the Otherworld unit of the Nine Hell Sword Sect. In the Nine Hell Sword Sect, one could identify which unit a person belonged to by the letters on their chest. The Otherworld unit, the Hell unit, and the Despair unit were considered the three axes that supported the sect, though that term was only used by outsiders who didn't fully understand the internal structure. Muhoi knew that the Otherworld unit had not earned any merits and had been completely pushed aside in the competition for succession. The true power lay within the Hell and Despair units, which were at war with the brutal dragon faction. Muhoi found it strange. He wondered why the Nine Hell Sword Sect, which was at war with the hidden dragon faction, suddenly had its eyes on the south of Shaanxi. After thinking for a moment, he figured out the mission of the Otherworld unit in this war, which their task was to protect the headquarters and provide rear support. However, the Otherworld unit, hungry for merits, had pretended to fulfill their duties on the outside while actually being involved in their dealing to line their pocket. Red Wolf Sword asked how Muhoi knew this, but Muhoi simply replied that he knew Red Wolf Sword assumed the Otherworld unit would step in for him if he died. Unfortunately for him, the Otherworld unit would do nothing but hide his death at all costs. Muhoi told him that instead of supporting the war, Red Wolf Sword had been up to something else entirely. He pointed out that this situation provided the perfect opportunity for the Hell unit and the Despair unit to strike the Otherworld unit down. Even if the Otherworld unit came for revenge at Manhwa, Muhoi asked Red Wolf Sword if he thought he would be scared of them. Muhoi continued, stating that even the Hell and Despair units wouldn't be enough to face him, let alone the Otherworld unit. It was him who had faced the Nine Hell Sword Sect alone. Red Wolf Sword's eyes widened, realizing that his fate was sealed. The leader, who had been watching this, decided to bury his head back in the ground, trying to convince himself that he hadn't seen anything. But someone grabbed him. Muhoi pulled him out and asked why he was still lying down. He ordered the leader to deal with the situation immediately. The leader, nervously, replied with a single word of affirmation. Several books were scattered on a desk. Muhoi browsed through them, noticing entries detailing protection taxes, gambling den income, and lists of people who had borrowed money, along with the amounts they owed. He observed how well the leader had kept track of the financial flow. The underworld men sat on the floor, while Muhoi stayed at the back, guarding them. Muhoi asked if this was all the leader had, and the leader confirmed. Muhoi then told them that the money they had taken and extorted from others would be returned to its rightful owners. Additionally, they would shut down the gambling den, and the underworld men had to finish the job by the end of the day. He asked if there were any complaints. The leader expressed that completing all of this would be difficult. Muhoi looked unimpressed, and the leader decided not to argue further. Muhoi clarified that his decision not to kill them wasn't out of mercy. He described the men as trash who didn't deserve to die, but if they did, there would be no one left for the victims to direct their anger toward. He told them not to think they could atone for their actions through death, as their sins were heavier than death itself. It was only right for them to live and atone for the rest of their lives. He asked if they understood, and they bowed their head in affirmation. Muhoi instructed the faction leader to stay, while the others should start moving. They needed to act swiftly to complete everything by the end of the day. He told Muhoi, and Manhwa to ensure the underworld men were tearing things down and returning the money. Manhwa then inquired about what Muhoi planned to do. Muhoi simply replied that he had something else to take care of. Manhwa asked if Muhoi was going to go drinking again like last time. Muhoi, with a slight grin, responded with a question of his own, if it looked like he was the kind of person who could drink any time. Muhoi reminded her to keep an eye on the underworlds, to which Manhwa assured him that they would be fine. Muhoi noted that Manhwa was quicker to catch on than he had expected, but this time, he wasn't going to ask for alcohol. The leader, still shaken, asked why Muhoi wanted him to stay. Muhoi told him not to try to hide anything, as he could clearly smell what was going on. He ordered the leader to take him to where the tuber fleece flower was located. Muhoi, recalling that in his past life, remembered the time he had searched for rare opportunities to grow stronger. He didn't have a sect to support him, so to obtain elixirs, he needed a vast amount of money. Lacking the funds, he searched for rare ingredients on his own. Of course, these were hard to find for a reason, and they couldn't be acquired by simply looking. One day, while resting after training, he had stumbled upon the tuber fleece flower, which had taken 7 years wandering to find. The smell was bitter, with a dull, earthy scent, the one he could never forget. The leader led Muhoi down a passage, and as they descended the stairs, the scent of the tuber fleece flower grew stronger, signaling that they were close. The leader explained that it was a 200-year-old tuber fleece flower they had obtained by accident and had been storing ever since. He admitted that he had forgotten about it due to the chaos, but didn't expect Muhoi to recognize it by its scent. The leader praised Muhoi for his sharp senses and added that the Red Wolf sword had originally planned to take it, but now it had found a master more suited to it. Muhoi praised the leader for his good work and instructed him to go back to his tasks. He locked the door behind him, the tuber fleece flower now within his reach. Most organizations or forces capable of martial arts have a space where they can practice energy circulation. The iron doors and thick stone walls were solid, leaving Muhoi with no reason to worry. In his past life, he had consumed a 300-year-old tuber fleece flower. While a 200-year-old one wouldn't be as potent, it was still incredibly valuable. When he opened the box to enjoy it, he was taken aback. He exclaimed in surprise, noticing that this 200-year-old tuber fleece flower was far larger than the 300-year-old one he had eaten in his past life. He speculated that the tuber fleece flower must be at least 400 years old. The one he had found in his previous life had been exceptionally difficult to obtain, so he hadn't expected to find such a rare one so easily. As Muhoi swallowed it, he felt something was off about ingesting it by himself. He decided that the next time he found something good, he would share it with others. Some time passed. The leader sensed something, an unsettling tremor occurred, almost like an earthquake. He looked around, then peered out the window. Dust covered the area, and eventually a man stepped out. It was Muhoi, looking refreshed. The leader rushed to him and reported the strange noise, but Muhoi dismissed it as unimportant. He then asked the leader if he really had time to stroll around. He questioned whether the leader had thoroughly checked the ledger, to which the leader responded that he had been doing so until he had to come down. Muhoi told him he would check it later to ensure the money had been returned, urging him to do it properly. The leader wished him a safe trip, but once Muhoi left, he muttered under his breath, calling him a bastard and complaining about his rude manner. Putting that aside, the leader found himself curious about the noise, especially considering the condition of the building. However, he didn't pay it much mind since the building was bound to be destroyed regardless. He couldn't help but wonder what effect the tuber fleece flower had on Muhoi to cause such a disturbance. The building was in disarray, with parts scattered everywhere. The underworld men looked exhausted. Muchiol approached the leader and reminded him that the sun was about to rise. He asked if the leader really had time to rest. The leader stood up, replying that he didn't. Muhoi also instructed the rest of the men to hurry and tear the buildings down since daylight was fast approaching. Meanwhile, a box filled with silver was opened. The recipient could hardly believe it, and the underworld men bowed down, explaining that it was the money they had unfairly extorted from him, so it was only right for him to take it. He apologized profusely. Someone had been spying on them. It was Jingi, who hadn't expected Muhoi to defeat the Red Wolf Sword and handle the brutal blood faction so swiftly. It had only been 2 days since he provided Muhoi with information, and now, witnessing the aftermath, he realized Muhoi was no ordinary person. To Jingi, it seemed like Manhwa was hiding a dragon. Muhoi appeared behind him and casually uttered a greeting. He explained that he came to have a drink because he was feeling a little peckish but realized it wouldn't be fun to drink alone. He added that the alcohol and refreshments were ready and asked Jingi what he thought. Jingi was puzzled, noting that it was still too early in the morning. He commented that the young master seemed to know how to drink, but he agreed to join him. Once they were seated at the table, Muhoi asked Jingi what he was curious about. Muhoi knew that Jingi already knew about the events, but still, he shared that the Red Wolf Sword was dead and the brutal blood faction was being dealt with. Muhoi had already returned the funds to their rightful owners, but the problem remained with the underworlders. They had become underworlders out of necessity, with no other way to survive or make a living. Muhoi expressed his desire to rehabilitate them, to use them for the reconstruction of Pasang. He then asked Jingi if he knew anyone who could take them under their wing and provide them with work. Though they were possessed martial arts, Muhoi reassured Jingi not to worry. He was thinking of severing their dantian while he was there for 3 days. Jingi replied that severing dantian was not so easily done. He was surprised once again by Muhoi's words, but assured him that he knew a few merchants. He also reassured Muhoi not to worry about the underworlders, promising to check on them from time to time to ensure they were learning trades and not causing problems. Muhoi thanked him, and Jingi replied that it was they who should be thanking him for the opportunity to help. Jingi then changed the subject, asking how long Muhoi planned to stay in Pasang. Muhoi replied that he still had 2 outer Sect divisions to visit. He needed to see them within a fixed time frame, so he would be in Pasang for 3 days. He then brought up that he had heard there were some strongholds near Pasang and inquired if Muhoi planned to deal with them as well. Under the night sky, the streets were bustling with activity as Muhoi set a drink down on the table, praising the 3 disciples for their excellent work. Mujin, curious, asked what the bottle was for, to which the 3 disciples looked surprised. Muhoi explained that the bamboo leaf liquor had been prepared as a way to celebrate their successful completion of their first real mission. Mujin, however, replied that they did not drink. Muhoi nodded in understanding, recalling that in their sect, alcohol was not consumed casually. It was only for special occasions, like the end of the year or to mark significant achievements. He then added that new prospects to the Jianghu die the most during their first real mission. He was certain that the 3 disciples had felt the weight of that truth. He continued, noting that while the martial arts of the underworld were weak, their intentions were clear. The men had charged with the intent to kill, and the 3 disciples had not been prepared to harm them. Muhoi stressed that this was the reality of the world outside. Despite their superior martial skills compared to the underworld, the difference between life and death wasn't always determined by one's abilities alone. Muhoi pointed out that many newcomers to the Jianghu overlooked this fact and paid a terrible price for it. Yet, these 3 disciples had made it through unscathed. This alone was worth celebrating, and with that, Muhoi insisted they drink. Still unsure, Mujin asked if it was also Muhoi's first mission. Muhoi chuckled, admitting that it indeed was. The 4 disciples raised their cups, congratulating themselves for having completed their first mission safely. The bamboo leaf liquor was surprisingly smooth, and Mujin remarked that it didn't taste bitter, which Muhoi readily agreed with. She added that if all liquor tasted as good, She could easily drink herself silly every day. However, Mujin warned her not to overdo it. Meanwhile, Mu Chiol remained silent, deep in thought. His mind drifted back to the fight with the Red Wolf sword. The technique Muhoi had used didn't resemble the Manhwa swordsmanship he was familiar with. He couldn't shake the curiosity about what it truly was. Unable to hold back, Mu Chiol finally expressed his thoughts to Muhoi, asking about the sword technique he had witnessed. He explained that while Muhoi's technique had initially seemed like Manhwa swordsmanship, the moment he deflected the Red Wolf sword strike, the style had transformed into something entirely unfamiliar. The power was concentrated, and the sword's curves lacked their usual fluidity. Mu Chiol wished to understand more about this unique form of sword manipulation. Muhoi was amused, considered how they had been focused on dealing with the underworld, but hadn't realized he was also being observed. He noted that the technique he used did indeed contain the principle of weight. This was part of the Donko sword technique he had created in his past life. He had incorporated the concept of weight into the basic movements of the six-fold combo sword technique. He was surprised that Mu Chiol had noticed it. Muhoi acknowledged that Mu Chiol had also recognized the differences in the technique, but had not been able to pinpoint its origin. He had planned to explain it eventually, but now was not the right time. He told the group that before they could discuss it further, there was something else they needed to address. He asked if they had finished their drinks, encouraging them to do so, as they would not have time to drink for the next 3 days. Elsewhere, a carriage moved through the night, traveling along a forest path. Suddenly, someone emerged from the bushes and commanded the coachman to stop. The coachman asked what the matter was, but the man simply threatened him, demanding everything they had or facing death. From a distance, Muhoi and the 3 disciples observed the scene. Muhwa quickly deduced that the men were bandits. Muhoi explained that these men hid in the forest and waited for travelers to rob. They were part of a larger group, but were not typical underworld criminals. The major difference was that they had learned martial arts and operated more systematically. While the previous group they had encountered had also practiced martial arts, their training had been for specific, targeted purposes, making them different from the usual underworld figures. These bandits, on the other hand, were more organized and posed a greater threat. Muhoi warned the disciples that if they encountered such bandits, they should assume a stronghold was nearby. From what he knew, there were at least 5 such strongholds around Pasong, though he wasn't certain of their exact locations. One thing was clear, however, these bandits were stronger than those under the Red Wolf sword. Muhwa understood, but she couldn't help but ask why Muhoi was sharing this information with them. Muhoi responded that for the next 3 days, they would be eliminating all the strongholds. One disciple would handle each stronghold while the others observed. The 3 disciples were surprised, and Muhwa, clearly nervous, stammered as she asked why Muhoi had made that decision. She wondered if it was because they had done something wrong. Muhoi, puzzled by her question, asked what she meant. He reminded them that they had nearly died during their last encounter because they hadn't been prepared to take down the underworld members. He clarified that the task he had given them was meant to prepare them for such situations, where they might have to harm others to survive. The weight of his words finally sank in. Mu Chiol agreed with Muhoi, acknowledging that they could have died if it hadn't been for the senior disciple's intervention. He believed that the mission was a good way for them to learn. Mujin, still uncertain, asked how Muhoi had prepared himself to harm others. Muhoi struggled with the question, as he knew this wasn't his first real fight, but he couldn't share that with them. Instead, he recalled his first real battle happened so long ago, but still vivid in his memory. He had been young and severely injured. He could remember the fear he felt, the fear that if he didn't kill, he would be the one to die. Muhoi explained that he had been afraid of dying and, more so, afraid that the other disciples might get hurt. That fear drove him to slay the enemy before him, ensuring that his worst fears didn't come true. Mujin listened intently, and Muhoi added that his words were just a reference. Every fighter had to find their own path to battle. He then turned to Mu Chiol and brought up the topic of the sword technique Mu Chiol had observed. He promised that he would teach Mu Chiol the technique depending on his performance during the stronghold mission. As a start, Muhoi had planned to demonstrate how to eliminate a whole stronghold, and now was the time to show them how it was done. He instructed them to watch closely. The bandit was soon buried upside down in the ground, with the coachman expressing his thanks to the young martial artist. Muhoi yanked the bandit from the hole and slapped him across the face. The bandit, bruised and battered, pointed toward his base, where armed men awaited. The men, clearly annoyed, were swiftly defeated by Muhoi in a blink of an eye, leaving them unconscious on the ground. It was swift. Muhoi had single-handedly taken down all the thugs. Thus began the 3 days of intense training. During the day, the disciples kept watch over the brutal blood faction, while at night, they handled the strongholds. The training was difficult at first, as everyone hesitated. Manhwa almost got slashed in the process. But soon, the disciples started to gain confidence, learning to act more quickly in response to danger. The hesitation that had once plagued them began to fade, much sooner than Muhoi had anticipated. They were all performing well against the strongholds, though Mujin still struggled a bit. It wasn't that he was lacking in skill. In fact, he was better than both Manhwa and Muchiol in terms of technique. However, Mujin hesitated to kill, even when facing certain death. It became clear to Muhoi that Mujin was more afraid of harming others than he was of dying. Having watched Mujin closely, Muhoi understood the root of the problem, but he knew that Mujin had to overcome it on his own. With that, Muhoi informed the disciples that they had completed all the stronghold missions ahead of schedule. It had only taken 2 days instead of the expected 3. He praised them for their hard work and announced that they would leave for Wayan as planned, advising them to rest until the following day. Curious, Manhwa asked what they would be doing that day. Muhoi replied that he would fulfill his promise to Muchiol and teach him a new technique. Manhwa inquired if the rest of them would be included as well. Muhoi confirmed that they would all participate, as it would benefit them too. Not enthusiastic, Manhwa had hoped for a break, but expected Muhoi to push them further instead. Muhoi gripped his sword and, with a single fluid motion, made a large slash that left a dent in the ground. The 3 disciples were left speechless. Muhoi explained that what they had just witnessed was Manhwa's 6-fold combo sword technique, modified by adding more weight to each strike. Muchiol, intrigued by the concept of weight, asked Muhoi to elaborate. Muhoi explained that the traditional Manhwa sword techniques allowed the practitioner to proceed to the next move, even if the sword path was blocked or destroyed. This was partly due to the many variations in the movements, but also because there was no distinction between offense and defense in the 6-fold combo. The technique was fluid, linking together offense and defense seamlessly. Muhoi went on to explain that, moving forward, he would be teaching them his personal interpretation of the 6-fold combo, with elements of illusion and change added to the technique. Muchiol, finally starting to grasp the concept, was eager to learn more. Muhoi assumed that the 3 disciples were aware he was referring to the Manhwa sword saint. He knew that Master Zhou wasn't the first to create such a technique, but as far as Muhoi was concerned, Master Hyunzhou was the best at it. That also meant that Master Hyunzhou possessed a profound understanding of martial arts. Muhoi explained that Master Hyunzhou had spent considerable time thinking about the 6-fold combo sword technique. He had concluded that the flamboyant change, even the plum blossom, were all variations of the 6-fold combo, just different branches of the same technique. Muhoi revealed that Master Hyunho had been quietly working on creating a new technique, one that involved the weight of the sword, much like Muhoi had demonstrated. He shared that the technique was incomplete and, on top of that, Manhwa didn't have a system that deeply explored the concept of the sword's weight. Learning an unfinished technique when a solid foundation already existed could be seen as foolish or even wrong. Muhoi explained that Master Hyunzhou had kept his work a secret because he understood the dangers of an incomplete technique. He asked the 3 disciples if this was truly the technique they wanted. After considering the question, Muchiol looked determined and responded affirmatively. He requested Muhoi teach him the technique. The training began that same night. By the time the sun rose, Manhwa already had dark circles under her eyes. She couldn't help but wonder how long they were expected to keep watch. She turned to Mujin and suggested they go for a run. Meanwhile, Muhoi was explaining to Muchiol that Muchiol had been wielding his sword using the principle of illusion. He told him to forget everything he knew about that principle and focus on understanding the principle of weight. Muhoi explained the difference in how they should use the sword, and Muchiol, concentrating hard, tried his best to follow. Meanwhile, Muhoi and Mujin walked away. Muhoi suggested they go observe the underworld members and rest afterward. Mujin agreed, and they headed off. At a nearby building, a man yelled at a servant, complaining that he wasn't getting anything done at a slow pace. The servant approached the man and explained that his back and stomach had been aching since the day before. Muhoi, observing the situation, realized that Muhoi's words about those who joined the underworld out of necessity being more motivated when given the opportunity were true. Muhoi had once considered them nothing more than trash, but now she saw that, even if they were aware she was watching, their inability to use martial arts made them far less threatening. She assumed Mujin was also keeping an eye on the underworld somewhere, so she decided to head back and rest. She felt content, knowing she had done what was necessary, and planned to rest well after the intense training. As Muhoi walked, a woman approached her. Muhoi immediately became alert, but was taken aback when she saw the woman had a bruised eye and couldn't even open it fully. Muhoi recognized her from their previous encounter with the brutal blood faction. The woman apologized for startling Muhoi, explaining it wasn't her intention. Then Muhoi noticed the young girl the woman was holding. The woman introduced her younger sister, Young. Muhoi swiftly sheathed her sword and asked the woman how her wound was. The woman explained that she was a bit sensitive due to overwork and thanked Muhoi for saving her. Muhoi, feeling a warm surge of gratitude, blushed, feeling good about the situation. It made her wonder if this was why chivalrous fighters existed. The woman shared that her wound had healed quickly, and thanks to Muhoi, they had been able to carry out their father's funeral. Muhoi was confused for a moment before recalling the man who had died with his eyes open. She apologized for not being more helpful earlier and hoped their father could rest in peace. The woman reassured her, saying she hadn't mentioned it to receive any pity. Instead, she was thankful that Muhoi had saved her, so that her sister, Young, would not be left alone. The young girl blushed and, with great sincerity, expressed she wanted to become an impressive chivalrous fighter like Muhoi when she grew older. Overcome with emotion, Muhoi was about to burst into tears. Confused, the woman wondered why Muhoi was crying. She asked the little girl if her name was indeed Young and told her that she could achieve her dream. Young asked if it was true, and Muhoi assured her that she could even become greater than herself. Muhoi continued to cry, and the woman became flustered, asking if Muhoi was injured. Muhoi replied that it wasn't that. As dusk fell and the night sky appeared, Mujin sat in a room, brooding with a grim expression on his face, lost in thought. The next day, Muhoi was irritated when she saw Muhoi walking quickly, clearly in a hurry. She asked him why he was rushing, wondering what had caused the sudden urgency. Muhoi was confused. He told Muhoi that he wasn't rushing, but rather, it was her who was moving too slowly. He asked if she had become lax after just one day of rest. It seemed to him that she had been slacking in her usual training, so he decided to keep a closer watch on her. Muhoi complained, saying they should have left earlier, questioning why they had even rested for a day. Muhoi glared at her, and immediately she stopped complaining. Mujin, noticing the tension, wondered if the underworld members in Pasung were rehabilitating properly. From their observation, there didn't seem to be any issues, but Mujin fell silent when he saw the senior disciple's grim expression. He quickly changed the subject, and Muhoi assured him that there was no need to worry. The beggar sect would continue to monitor the underworld members. What the disciples needed to focus on, Muhoi explained, was strengthening their mentalities. He considered increasing the difficulty of their training to push them further. Mujin realized that he had failed to change the topic, and both he and Muhoi shared a similar thought, that they were likely meeting their end soon. Out loud, Muhoi expressed that she missed Young. Muhoi, now curious, asked about her. Muhoi explained that Young was the younger sister of a girl she had saved during the brutal Blood Faction's attack. Muhoi recounted meeting the girl while watching the underworld members and how the little girl had told her she wanted to become an impressive chivalrous fighter when she grew up. Muhoi, feeling an unusual sense of nervousness, realized it was the first time he had ever worried about a young child's future. Muhoi realized Muhoi was teasing her. Just then, Muchiel noticed Muhoi had stopped walking. Muhoi announced that they had arrived in Wayan. He was glad they reached their destination before sunset. Mujin pointed out that there was a sect called the Fresh Flower Sect in Wayan. Muhoi decided that they would have dinner there, and Muhwa was enthusiastic about the idea. Muhoi, however, teased her once more, bringing up her earlier complaint about his speed. At the Fresh Flower Sect, a commotion broke out. A kid punched a gray-haired boy, causing him to fall into the arms of another bully. The one who punched told the others to hold the boy down while he struck him again. The gray-haired boy winced in pain. Just as the bully raised his fist for another blow, his hand was stopped by someone. The figure, Muhoi, observed that the child had been using quite a bit of internal energy for such an act. The kid glanced around nervously and saw more men in black uniforms appear. The gray-haired boy recognized the clothing, that they belonged to disciples of the original Manhwa sect. Muhoi spoke, telling the bully that his actions could have killed a child who hadn't learned martial arts yet. He glared at the bully and pointed out that he must have known the danger of using such force. The bully shot him an arrogant glare, and Muhoi noticed the child's arrogance despite his youth. He quickly realized that the issue lay with the child's upbringing. Muhoi understood that the child had simply been influenced by his parents, and the child himself was not entirely at fault. The bully continued to glare at Muhoi, prompting him to threaten the boy. He warned him that if he kept glaring at someone while knowing he was wrong, he might end up getting slapped in the face. Muhoi noted that the boy seemed to be part of an orthodox group, so he asked if the sect had taught him to behave in such a manner. Before he could finish his sentence, a small hand tugged at his shirt. The gray-haired boy had moved in front of the bully, as if to protect him from Muhoi. Muhoi watched the exchange for a moment before stepping back, releasing the bully and instructing them to leave. The bullies quickly retreated. The gray-haired boy, offering a fist-palm salute, introduced himself as Lim Sanha of the Fresh Flower Sect. He thanked Muhoi for his help. Muhoi introduced himself as a second-generation disciple of the Manhwa sect. Concerned, Muhwa asked the boy if he was all right. Sanha confirmed he was fine. Muhoi inquired about the identity of the bullies. Sanha explained that the kid was the young leader of the Great Truth sect, and the others were disciples from the same sect. Confused, Muhwa asked why the bullies were targeting Sanha. The boy sighed and explained that his sect had never gotten along with the Great Truth sect. Recently, the bullies had discovered that Sanha's sect was weaker than theirs, so they had started picking on him. Muhoi assumed that the young leader was the one throwing the punches. Curious, Mujin asked if Sanha's sect leader knew about the bullying. Sanha replied that yes, his sect leader was aware, and that he used to fight back and beat the bullies. Eventually, the Fresh Flower Sect leader went to the Great Truth sect to address the issue. However, the Great Truth sect leader argued that their disciples wouldn't have acted without reason and blamed Sanha. They attempted to turn the situation into a sect-level conflict, but the Fresh Flower Sect leader, wanting to avoid war, backed off. Muhoi listened carefully. He knew that if the Fresh Flower Sect were to get into a conflict with the Great Truth sect, it would likely lead to their downfall. Muhoi assumed the best the Fresh Flower Sect could do was ensure that the Great Truth sect had no reason to invade. He now understood why Sanha had asked for help without directly saying anything, which is that Sanha was concerned that the situation might escalate into a conflict between the two sections. That was also why he had allowed the children to bully him. Muhwa, angry at how an outer sect of Manhwa was being treated, voiced her frustration. Muhoi explained to them that there was a reason why they were sent to manage the outer sections. He decided it was time to hear the full details from the Fresh Flower Sect leader. At the Fresh Flower Sect, the members were amazed to see the disciples of the Manhwa sect. Muhoi noted that the main sect disciples were known for the red plum blossoms on their clothing, while the outer sects bore white plum blossoms. He saw that the Fresh Flower Sect's members had white plum blossoms embroidered onto their clothes. Soon, the leader arrived and expressed that they had been waiting to meet them. The four disciples made the fist-palm salute as a respectful greeting, and Muhoi introduced himself, thanking the leader for the warm welcome. The leader, Lim Muguk, reciprocated the greeting and the salute. He shared that they had been hearing about how Muhoi and his disciples had managed to take down the brutal blood faction in a single night. Muhoi humbly replied that the rumors in Jianghu had been exaggerated. It hadn't been done overnight. Muguk laughed, acknowledging that the important thing was that the brutal blood faction had been taken care of. He then asked Sanha if he was the one who brought them there, to which Sanha replied affirmatively. Muguk praised his son, and Muhoi watched him intently. Muguk invited them inside. Once seated, they had tea, and Mu Chiol commented that the scent was deeper than the plum blossom tea from Manhwa. Mujin added that it tasted great, especially since it was freshly brewed. Muguk humbly replied that it wasn't as good as Manhwa's, adding that he hadn't forgotten the taste of their plum blossom tea and that it made him think of visiting again. Then he realized he should have let them rest before discussing matters further. Muhoi assured him that it was fine. Since the sect leader had sent them to take care of the outer sects, it was only right to do so. He then inquired about the situation at the Fresh Flower sect. Muguk admitted that they were in a difficult position. When Muhoi asked if this was due to the Great Truth sect, Muguk confirmed that while their relationship with them had never been good, it had been manageable in the past when both sects were more or less equal in strength. Muhoi concluded that things must have changed since the Shangxi massacre, and Muguk agreed. He explained that after the Great Truth sect learned the extent of the damage the Fresh Flower sect had suffered, they had become bolder. They had been obstructing the Fresh Flower sect at every turn, and now they were intervening in their interests and provoking them. Muguk shared that even the young leader of the Great Truth sect had been bullying his son. He seemed deeply saddened that Sanha had suffered again that day. Mujin, surprised that Muguk knew about the bullying, asked how he had figured it out. Muguk explained that although his son had tried to hide it, he, as a father, would always know. He admitted that he would love to confront the Great Truth sect with his sword, but he knew that would be exactly what they wanted. He recognized that the Great Truth sect was attempting to take over the Fresh Flower sect, no matter what it took, and there was nothing he could do about it. Despite his son coming home after being bullied, he felt that as a father and as a sect leader, he had failed. Mujin asked why he hadn't asked for help from Manhwa. Muguk replied that he was aware of the current situation at Manhwa and had planned to request help once they had recovered. He expressed his relief now that the disciples had arrived, saying that he could sense their determination and spirit just from sitting with them. He believed that the presence of Manhwa's disciples alone would deter the Great Truth sect. Muhoi responded, pointing out that if Muguk truly had faith in them, he wouldn't have looked so troubled. Mujin, moved by Muguk's words, agreed enthusiastically until he realized what Muhoi had just said, which confused him. Muhoi clarified that if Muguk really believed in the disciples, he wouldn't have made that face when talking about his son. Mu Chiol and Muhwa, unsure of what Muhoi meant, exchanged glances. Muguk dismissed the comment, claiming that Muhoi must have been seeing things. He insisted that not trusting the disciples of Manhwa was the same as not trusting Manhwa itself. He assured them that there was no way a mere outer sect leader would not trust them, then swiftly changed the subject to dinner. He invited the group to join him for dinner, but Muhoi, frustrated by Muguk's evasiveness, considered that Muguk may have harbored unrealistic expectations of Manhwa's assistance. Muhoi sympathized with Muguk, understanding that the leader had probably endured hardships while holding on to the hope that Manhwa would help. However, what he had received were young disciples on their first outing to the Jianghu. When they arrived, all he saw were kids, and it became clear that Muguk doubted their ability to help against a whole sect. Muhoi realized that this might be why Muguk had been so hesitant to fully trust them, fearing that the disciples might end up hurt in the face of such overwhelming opposition. While knowing the disciples were trying to help, Muguk decided to treat them during their stay and then send them back. However, Muguk couldn't stop thinking about his son and the other sect members who had been enduring harassment from the Great Truth sect. He felt a deep sense of pity for them. As these thoughts swirled in his mind, Muguk also wondered if, deep down, he secretly hoped that the young disciples would step in and offer help. He realized he couldn't even hide his emotions, and he chastised himself for it, feeling almost childish for showing his vulnerability. Yet, he was impressed by how perceptive Muhoi was, able to read his expression so accurately in such a brief moment. Muhoi, acknowledging Muguk's kindness, said he appreciated the gesture, but made it clear that they would handle their own dinner. Muhwa, Mu Chiol, and Mujin were all taken aback. Muhwa, feeling the tension, said that Muhoi's refusal seemed rude. Internally, Muhoi thought that it was actually the Fresh Flower sect that had been rude first. Confused, Muguk asked why they were turning down his goodwill. Muhoi knew he wouldn't be able to change Muguk's mind, and trying to convince him further would be a waste of time. He admitted that he couldn't accept the hospitality from Muguk, especially since they hadn't been of any help to the Fresh Flower sect. It didn't feel right. Everyone was taken aback by this admission. Still confused, Muhoi asked if Muhoi really meant that it wasn't right. As she recalled Muhoi's teachings about swinging a sword with one's whole body, about sparing lives, and a not-so-peaceful method they employed during the brutal blood faction ambush, and she began to doubt if the person standing before her was truly the same senior disciple she had come to know. She wondered what had happened to him that day. Senior appeared unusually agitated that day, a stark departure from his habitual indifference toward his duty. Muhoi noted that he, who had never truly cared for his responsibilities, now behaved with a focused urgency that suggested something was deeply amiss. As the group ambled along the mountain path, Muhoi remarked quietly that there must be an underlying cause for this sudden change. When Muhoi turned around, her surprise was evident, and it became clear that an explanation was both expected and needed. Muhoi contemplated internally that the progress made thus far should suffice, provided they were not an exceptionally advanced martial master present at the Fresh Flower Sect. After a reflective pause, he resolved to reveal the cause behind his altered demeanor. In a measured tone, he explained that the leader of the Fresh Flower Sect harbored a deep mistrust toward them, a revelation that complicated their mission. Muhoi recalled that the leader had previously indicated that the Great Truth Sect would cower merely at the sight of their presence, and Muhoi confirmed this recollection while questioning the inherent strangeness of such behavior. He recalled how the young disciples of the Great Truth Sect had behaved earlier. Although their youth might suggest inexperience, Muhoi stressed that even a child successor was bound by the same strictures of caution in both action and speech. There was a method behind the apparent indiscretion, which was a rationale that could not be ignored. Moreover, if the Great Truth Sect indeed chose retreat simply because of their presence, the situation was even more alarming. The leader of the Fresh Flower Sect was acutely aware of the struggles faced by the Manhwa sect. Despite having dispatched a disciple to oversee matters in the outer regions, the Manhwa contingent now consisted of merely 4 inexperienced disciples venturing into the Jianghu for the first time. The consequences of engaging the Great Truth Sect were dire, that a defeat would not only lead to the absorption of the Fresh Flower Sect by their rival, but also invite widespread criticism that Manhwa had failed to manage its own internal affairs. Such an outcome, Muhoi elaborated at length, would be catastrophic for all involved. In the midst of this tense discussion, the matter of strategy arose naturally. Muhoi sought guidance on the appropriate course of action. In response, Muhoi reiterated that as long as the underlying issue was resolved, the results would remain favorable. His tone carried quiet confidence, even as he left the specifics unspoken. When further pressed about the method of resolution, she quickly brushed it off and implied that Muhoi must already harbor a plan, even if unspoken at that moment. Later that day, upon arriving at an inn, the 4 disciples observed that 2 men from the Great Truth Sect were dining there. Muhoi surveyed the scene with dismay, knowing this establishment, which should have been the territory of the Fresh Flower Sect, was now being occupied by outsiders who behaved as if it were their own domain. The discontent in the eyes of the 2 men was unmistakable, suggesting that they were actively seeking vulnerable targets. It was evident that trouble would soon ensue, even if no one intervened directly. The tension escalated when a man clad in a green robe brushed past one of the Great Truth Sect members. The encounter drew immediate disapproving looks from the 2, who clearly noted the man's inebriated state. With a stumbling apology, the man explained that the recent increase in protection fees had stirred up resentment among the locals. In a frustrated whisper, he added that the men's glaring expressions hinted at a readiness to unleash violence on unsuspecting civilians. His parting words confirmed that, despite the inn's traditional ties to the Fresh Flower Sect, the Great Truth Sect had imposed extortion by raising protection fees. As the 4 disciples absorbed these developments, it became evident that the Great Truth Sect had effectively seized control of the inn. Amid murmurs of anger, another guest voiced his frustration. He was accusing the fee collectors of being leeches who not only extorted money, but also took advantage of complimentary food. His words, laced with indignation, were quickly tempered by a companion who cautioned him to speak softly lest their remarks attract unwanted attention. Through this overheard exchange, Muhoi deduced that the Great Truth Sect had already taken over the establishment. Their imposition of protection fees had understandably infuriated the local residents. Noticing the rising volume of heated discussion among the guests, Muhoi confidently predicted that conflict was imminent. With deliberate calm, he instructed the three other disciples not to intervene, trusting that events would unfold in their favor. However, Manhwa, often regarded as somewhat absent-minded, struggled to grasp the full implications of Muhoi's directive. Before further clarification could be offered, the situation took a dramatic turn. The two men from the Great Truth Sect abruptly rose from their seats. One, unable to tolerate the mounting tension, declared his frustration and, with a deliberate tap on a nearby guest's shoulder, implied that the guest's earlier remarks had been meant for their ears. The guest, in a tone dripping with condescension and devoid of respect, defiantly challenged the sect members, daring them to act. His inebriated state only magnified his insolence, prompting his companion to urge him to desist. Undeterred, the guest launched into a lengthy diatribe. He asserted that every word he had spoken was justified, denouncing the sect members for their hypocrisy, criticizing them for concealing themselves during an attack by the demonic cult, and then shamelessly extorting the people previously under the Fresh Flower Sect protection. His tirade escalated into a torrent of insults, labeling the offenders as demonic miscreants whose disgrace would forever bar them from public life. Finally, having endured the relentless rant, a member of the Great Truth Sect intervened decisively by seizing the insolent guest, yanking him from his seat, and forcefully throwing him to the floor. This chain of events left no doubt. The Great Truth Sect had seized control of the territory, and their actions cast a long shadow over the unfolding drama. At that moment, the man sneered as if certain his adversaries must consider them fools. He made it clear that insults directed at the Great Truth Sect will be met with severe consequences, all while brandishing his sword menacingly at fallen civilian. In swift response, Muhoi acted without hesitation. With precise aim, he hurled the chopsticks in his hand toward the man. The chopstick struck true, landing squarely on his acupoints and preventing any attempt to strike the civilian. Nearby, the other member of the Great Truth Sect let out a startled scream as the unfolding scene intensified. The aggrieved man, his pride stung, unsheathed his sword and demanded, in a tone of incredulity, an explanation for the unexpected interference. In a fluid motion, Muhoi closed the distance, delivering a kick that sent the man sprawling. Paralyzed by the chopstick still embedded in his shoulder, the man raged in confusion and indignation, questioning why he had been rendered immobile. Calmly retrieving the fallen sword, Muhoi remarked that the very act of wielding a sword toward people without even a modicum of martial arts knowledge was utterly absurd. He noted that while the boundaries between the orthodox and unorthodox alliances were often blurred, the current transgression was far too egregious. The man, recognizing Muhoi as a Manhwa disciple, as Muhoi inquired about the intended use of the weapon. His explanation, that was meant solely to intimidate, prompted Muhoi to seize the sword firmly and elaborate further. According to Muhoi's logic, the sword was never intended as a tool of casual threat against a weak opponent. He argued that it would be far more sensible for the man not to possess a sword at all. He added that mobility would be restored only once the obstructing chopstick was removed, perhaps by the unconscious man nearby, once he regained awareness, and that the sword might be reclaimed only by presenting himself at the Fresh Flower Sect. This edict left little room for dispute. In response, the man's anger escalated as he protested the interference with the Great Truth Sect's affairs, accusing Muhoi of instigating conflict. Unperturbed, Muhoi countered that even the leader of the Great Truth Sect would never utter such insolence, and that the man's attitude demonstrated a grave underestimation of Manhwa. Though the man stuttered his denials, his words fell flat against Muhoi's resolute rebuke. With final authority, Muhoi decreed that the sole means of absolution lay in the Great Truth Sect leader personally visiting the Fresh Flower Sect to beg for forgiveness. He warned that if the leader failed to appear by sunrise the next day, the Great Truth Sect would be consigned to oblivion. His unwavering stare and commanding tone brooked no resistance, and the man, with little choice, conceded as the three observing disciples watched in silence. Amid the simmering tension, Manhwa remarked that her senior disciple's brazenness seemed to grow with each passing day, suggesting that a preemptive ambush on the Great Truth Sect might have been more prudent. Mujin concurred with this assessment, while Mu Chiol voiced his apprehensions about the unfolding events. The following morning, the leader of the Great Truth Sect strode confidently toward the Fresh Flower Sect. Finally, armed with reason to challenge his rivals, he advanced with a smile and was flanked by his most senior members. Despite a clear sky overhead, an ominous thought suggested that those approaching should prepare for an impending storm of bloodshed. Muguk had only experienced such moments 3 times in his life. It felt as though a massive boulder was pressing down on his chest, suffocating him and making it hard to breathe. The first came during the bloody battle with the Black Knight Palace, when the disciples of Manhwa and its branch sects were slaughtered. The second came when his eldest son had passed away. The third was when he discovered that his youngest son was being bullied. Now, another moment had been added to that list: the arrival of the Great Truth Sect leader, accompanied by their strongest disciples. Muhoi greeted them at the gate with Muguk standing behind him. Despite Muhoi's tender age and the Jianghu, his expression remained unfazed, showing no fear whatsoever. Muhoi observed their faces, and Muhoi spoke, recognizing the lack of apology. Muhoi looked at the sect leader and noted with a mocking tone in his words as he addressed him. The opposition sect's leader regarded him with amusement. He questioned whether Manhwa had taught him martial arts, but neglected his manners. Muhoi responded with a tone laced with mockery, acknowledging his own lack of etiquette, but pointing out that the Great Truth Sect was far more negligent in such matters. The atmosphere surrounding the group was suffused with a killing intent, making them seem less like members of an orthodox sect and more akin to unorthodox warriors. No, perhaps even demonic cultists. The sect leader's temper flared at the young disciple's words, his hand reaching for his sword. Muhoi, however, calmly interrupted him, suggesting that instead of standing there in a tense standoff, they move inside to avoid drawing the wrong attention. After all, the situation could easily be misconstrued, and given the claims of the Great Truth Sect being orthodox, misunderstandings would not help their cause. His words defused the tension, making the sect leader reconsider. The sect leader dismissed the remark, accusing Muhoi of merely stalling for time. But since the matter would be settled regardless, perhaps there was some amusement to be found in humoring him. Reluctantly, the leader agreed to move inside. Had he refused, Muhoi had already decided on breaking his wrist and dragging him inside, though such action was now unnecessary. Muguk, seeing how things were unfolding, simply gestured for the visitors to come in. Everything had gone as Muhoi predicted, but now Muguk began to feel a growing unease. He had anticipated the situation, yet the weight of what had just transpired was heavy on his chest. The more he thought about it, the more nervous he became. He reflected on the moment he received the news of Muhoi's actions. As soon as he had learned what Muhoi had done, Muguk could not contain his frustration. He demanded to know why Muhoi had done this, especially since he had hoped to avoid unnecessary conflict with the Great Truth Sect. Muhoi responded calmly, affirming that he understood Muguk's concerns but offering no apology for his actions. Muguk, unable to suppress his frustration, asked why Muhoi would act this way despite understanding the situation. Muhoi then urged Muguk to calm down and speak honestly, offering a more measured approach to the conversation. Muhoi continued, acknowledging that Muguk did not trust them. He explained that when the sect leader had sent them to observe the branch sects, they hadn't been given specific instructions or deadlines. The sect leader had trusted them to use their judgment, making decisions as necessary while overseeing Mount Hua's branch sections. He also mentioned that the areas they were assigned to investigate were quite expansive: Pasung, Wayan, and Yeo Mountain, and the responsibility of covering such a large area with just 4 disciples was not insignificant. Muhoi admitted that he had left out some important details until now. He explained that the brutal blood faction in Pasung had connections with a warrior from the 9 Hellsword sect. Since their intention was to eliminate the brutal blood faction, a confrontation had been unavoidable. To avoid attracting unwanted attention from the 9 Hellsword sect, they had to handle the situation discreetly. Still skeptical, Muguk questioned whether Muhoi and the others had truly subdued a warrior from the 9 Hellsword sect without injury, especially with only 4 people involved. Muhoi clarified that it hadn't been 4 of them. It had been him alone who had dealt with a warrior. Now even more incredulous, Muguk asked how that could possibly be true. Muhoi simply nodded, affirming the reality of the situation. He then spoke with conviction, emphasizing that just as the Manhwa sect leader had placed trust in them, the Fresh Flower sect needed to trust them as well. Muhoi offered to prove his capabilities, suggesting that if Muguk doubted him, he could challenge him to a spar right then and there, and he will draw his sword without hesitation. However, Muguk did not take him up on the offer. Instead, Muguk asked if Muhoi truly believed they could handle the entire Great Truth sect should it come to that. Muhoi's response was unwavering. He assured Muguk that there was no need for such a confrontation, but even if a bloody battle were to break out, he would be more than capable of handling it alone. There was no doubt in his voice. He then spoke further, sharing his insights on the expected course of events. It was through this approach that the Great Truth sect leader had been brought to the table for discussion. Yet, despite those words, human nature was cunning, and now that the leader sat before them, the situation felt different. What had begun as a dispute between Muhoi and a disciple of the Great Truth sect had evolved into something far greater, deeply entangling the two sects in conflict. Muhoi proceeded with mediation, identifying himself as a disciple of Manhwa and recognizing the Fresh Flower sect as one of its branches. He suggested that it would be best for both sides to resolve the matter together. Since neither sect seemed inclined to coexist in Wayan, Muhoi got straight to the point. He proposed that each sect select a representative and settle the matter with a duel. His tone was calm and nonchalant as he made the offer. At those words, a wave of horror washed over Muguk. It was as though something inside him had snapped, triggered by the proposal. On the other hand, the leader of the Great Truth sect laughed upon hearing Muhoi's suggestion. He turned toward Muguk, a knowing smile on his face. He mused aloud, finally realizing the situation. He questioned whether this was a plan that Muguk and the Manhwa brat had devised together. He had thought there might be some trickery involved when they were invited in, but the suggestion of a duel seemed far too absurd to be a tactic. He mockingly wondered if Muguk had lost his mind, as there was no way that the brat would have proposed such a thing. Muhoi, hearing the leader's mocking expression, noticed the subtle shift in Muguk's demeanor when the leader mentioned the death of Muguk's eldest son. It was something Muhoi hadn't known before. It became apparent in the way Muguk's gaze hardened. The leader's words seemed to strike a painful memory in Muguk, and Muhoi understood the discomfort. Muhoi's eyes remained fixed on Muguk, his concern growing as the leader mocked how Muguk had placed his faith in a young Manhwa disciple, thinking that the brat would resolve everything. The leader's words had indeed hit a raw nerve, and Muhoi's voice, using the voice transmission technique, asked whether Muguk's son had been killed in a duel with the Great Truth sect. Muhoi quickly apologized, realizing that he had unintentionally brought up a painful memory. He repeated his apologies through the transmission, but Muguk, though clearly affected, reassured him that it was his fault for not bringing it up earlier. He trusted Muhoi and urged him to continue. Muhoi gave a brief acknowledgement, expressing his gratitude before refocusing on the matter at hand. While there were things he hadn't been aware of, he understood the weight of the situation. He proposed that 3 individuals participate in the duel: the sect leader, the young master, and the strongest fighters from each sect. For the Fresh Flower sect, Muhoi would take the role of the strongest fighter. He then suggested that they set the duel for 5 days later. The Great Truth sect leader, though still mocking the idea, requested that they consider their current situation. He explained that the last time they had been falsely accused of killing someone, it had caused a major headache for him. He was now cautious about being branded a murderer again, wondering if they would face such an accusation once more. Unbothered, Muhoi responded nonchalantly, explaining that the Great Truth sect was already being labeled as a demonic cult by the commoners. He reassured the leader that there was no need for concern in that regard. The sect leader, irritated by Muhoi's words, warned him that his mouth had been getting on his nerves. He threatened to attack the Fresh Flower sect right then and there, but admitted that he was holding back because Muhoi's proposal intrigued him. Muhoi continued his taunts, responding that he had only spoken out because he thought the leader wasn't fully aware of the situation. The leader, now visibly angered, warned Muhoi to watch his tongue, saying that they were only tolerating him for now. One of the Great Truth sect disciples sneered at Muhoi, suggesting that the brat thought they were easy targets because they had been holding back. Muhoi's gaze turned cold as he met the sneer, radiating enough killing intent to silence the disciple. The man, intimidated, stood nervously, unsure of the depth of Muhoi's strength. The Great Truth Sect leader, seeing the tense atmosphere, finally stood up and agreed to the proposal, stating that they would return in 5 days to settle the matter. Before leaving, he added that he hoped the duel would be fair and that no one would lose their life. Once they left, Muguk let out a deep sigh, his mind still troubled. He revealed that the Great Truth Sect's young master was far weaker than his own son in martial arts. While the sect leader and he had once been equals, the leader had now surpassed him. Muguk suspected that the warrior Muhoi would face might not be a true disciple, but an assassin the Great Truth Sect had secretly hired and disguised as a guest warrior. Muhoi nodded in agreement, acknowledging the possibility. Still unsure, Muguk asked if Muhoi was truly certain about the upcoming duel. Muhoi, without hesitation, replied that he was confident and might even find the duel too easy. Muguk, trusting him, agreed to put his faith in Muhoi and decided to proceed with the preparations. Muhoi suggested they head to the training ground, much to Muguk's surprise. He explained that while he couldn't be sure if the training would help, for the next 4 days, Muguk should consider himself as good as dead in terms of the difficulty he would face. Soon, they were at the training ground, where Muhoi began to train Muguk intensely, all the while being watched by 3 disciples who were both terrified and fascinated by what they saw. Among them, Manhwa voiced her concerns to her senior brother, Mujin, asking if this was truly the right approach, to which Mujin responded with uncertainty. Undeterred, Muguk pushed himself as though his life depended on it. His legs were tied to a tree branch, and he was forced to lift his body to sit up and hold it up, struggling under the weight of the intense training. Muhoi stood underneath him, holding a sword pointed upward, ready to welcome Muguk if he faltered. With a stern voice, Muhoi urged Muguk to push through. He reminded him that if he couldn't even handle this training, the Fresh Flower Sect would be finished. When Muguk hesitated, Muhoi's calm voice carried a hint of real threat, urging him to get back up quickly. As Muguk struggled to continue, one of the disciples, Manhwa, silently wondered if even the demonic cult would be impressed by such methods. In her mind, Muhoi's relentlessness seemed inhuman, bordering on demonic. Nearing the end of the day, the golden sun started to dim. Muguk continued his intense training with the sword still stood beneath his back. This time, the sword was held by Mukiel. The Manhwa disciple warned that if Muguk lowered himself any further, he would be at risk of being stabbed. He encouraged him to hold on just a little longer, reassuring him that the training would soon be over and to stay strong until the very end. Mukiel couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy as he watched, recalling that the senior disciple had assigned him the task of overseeing the sect leader's training, though he wondered where the senior brother had gone. Meanwhile, Santa sat alone, sulking. He was growing increasingly anxious about the upcoming duel in 5 days. Master Muhoi had promised to personally train him until the duel, but Santa knew that just 4 days of training wouldn't suddenly make him stronger. He voiced his frustration loudly, kicking a stone away from him in frustration. It was then that Muhoi appeared suddenly, startling Sanha. Santa immediately called out to Muhoi in surprise. Muhoi, picking up on the boy's earlier frustration, answered him directly. He explained that martial arts, as Santa had already stated, couldn't be mastered in just a short time with intense training. Growth took time, unless through a lucky encounter or a special elixir. However, that only applied to improving martial arts skills. That experience was different. How one used martial arts was a separate issue altogether. Muhoi then posed a question to Sanha, who was still trying to understand the lesson. Muhoi asked if Sanha was properly utilizing the martial arts he already possessed. Sanha snapped out of his daze, quickly replying that he knew his body best. Muhoi instructed him to watch closely and follow along, assuring him that this would be sufficient for now. Still confused, Sanha asked what exactly he was supposed to follow. Without further explanation, Muhoi suddenly sent a stone flying through the air with incredible speed, striking a tree with such force that the wood splintered from a considerable distance. Sanha watched in awe as Muhoi explained that he had infused the stone with energy slightly weaker than what children his age typically had. He pointed out that Santa's internal energy was much stronger than this, and so he should be able to control his energy at that level. Muhoi then challenged Sanha to demonstrate how he could handle his internal energy. He promised that if Sanha succeeded, the training would be over for the day. If not, they would continue until he managed it, advising him not to worry too much. Still in disbelief, Sanha was instructed to begin throwing the stone. Later, the evidence of his efforts was visible on a tree within the sect, marking his progress. It wasn't perfect, but Muhoi noted that Sanha had significantly improved. He decided to stop the training for the day and instructed Sanha to rest. As Muhoi reminded him to get some rest, Sanha was utterly exhausted. He slumped his knees, his left hand, which had been used for the training, trembling in pain, blistered and red. Frustrated, Sanha muttered to himself that Master Muhoi was a demon. He complained that Muhoi had told him to rest, but the boy felt that no rest was possible with the intense training. His frustration was clear in his voice as he muttered that the sun had risen, but rest was still out of the question. No tears came, but his frustration were palpable. A few hours later, Muhoi gathered Muguk and Sanha for the second day of training. He informed them that from now on, they would train together, as time was short. Muhoi then asked if they remembered the lessons from the previous day, particularly the importance of using their bodies effectively. Both Muguk and Sanha nodded, sat on their knee before Muhoi in acknowledgement. Muhoi noted that Muguk's physical condition had greatly improved, likely due to his diligent training. His body, once stiff, had quickly regained its previous form. Muhoi praised their progress and explained that today's training would build upon the foundation established the previous day. He unsheathed his sword and informed them that the focus for the day would be on finding their composure. Instead of further explaining, he felt it would be more effective to show them directly. With a firm instruction to take their positions, he prepared for the next phase of training. The three second-generation disciples, Muhoi, Mujin, and Mukiel, stood ready with their swords in hand, prepared to demonstrate their skills in front of their senior disciple. All the disciples of the Manhwa sect stood before their senior, Muhoi, their attention fixed on him, with Sanha watching closely. The tension in the air was palpable. Muguk wondered to himself about the nature of the duel, his thoughts echoing his surprise. Both he and Sanha could sense the intensity of the situation. The three disciples, equally nervous, knew all too well the ruthless nature of their senior disciple, Muhoi. Mukiel, Muhoi, and Mujin, the only ones who truly understood Muhoi's fierce approach, couldn't hide their own anxiety. Muhoi spoke first, announcing her intention to go ahead. Following her, Mujin said to prepare for their moves. The three then took their stances. Without warning, Muhoi charged forward, her sword aimed at a fatal strike. However, Muhoi remained still, using the scabbard of his sword to deflect her swift attack. When Muhoi tried again, swinging her hand downward to strike at his head, Muhoi merely shifted slightly to evade the blow. Though a woman, Muhoi was also a warrior, and she didn't hesitate to fight back. In retaliation, Muhoi kicked her ruthlessly in the chest, sending her flying backward. At that moment, Mujin appeared from behind, poised to strike. But Muhoi was quick, swinging his sword upward to completely neutralize Mujin's attack. With calm precision, Muhoi returned a series of sword strikes toward Mujin, each one pushing him back. Watching the scene unfold, Sanha, overwhelmed by the violence, whispered to his father, expressing concern about the dangerous nature of the training. Equally troubled, Muguk agreed, but decided to observe further, unsure of what exactly Muhoi was trying to teach them. Muhoi then delivered a precise strike with his sword scabbard to Mujin's chest, causing him to stagger back. Noticing the timing, Mukiel suddenly screamed for Mujin to duck. In that instant, Muhoi's sword moved, and Mujin ducked just in time as Mukiel's sword narrowly missed him. With nonchalance, Muhoi met the incoming sword with his own, calmly blocking it while letting out a small sigh. Muhoi muttered that Mukiel's sword felt heavier than before, though it was still not enough. He added that it wasn't enough to stop him, as his blade moved along the length of Mukiel's sword and stopped, inches from his neck. Realizing his defeat, Mukiel admitted he had lost. Muhoi then evaluated each of the disciples' weaknesses. He remarked that Muhoi's attacks were predictable and easy to counter. while Mujin was too passive in his approach. As for Mukiel, he hadn't yet fully adapted to his new sword technique. These were the major flaws that Muhoi identified. He acknowledged that there were other issues to address, but emphasized that they should focus on the points he had just highlighted first. Turning his attention to Muguk and Sanha, Muhoi explained that today's training, and the entire training leading up to the duel, would follow this intense pattern. Still confused, Muguk asked for clarification. He questioned how this brutal training could be the way to find composure, as Muhoi had earlier stated. Muhoi confirmed that the goal was indeed composure, but not in the way Muguk might have imagined. He asked Muguk if he had noticed anything unusual about the duel. Muguk, still uneasy, responded that the intensity was the most obvious difference. Muguk then exclaimed in disbelief, as if he understood something. Muhoi explained that one of the best ways to improve quickly was by gaining real combat experience, and the quickest way to achieve that was by repeatedly facing near-death situations. He added that once one had experienced the dangers of life-or-death combat multiple times, dodging attacks from ordinary fighters would become second nature. Muhoi then instructed Muguk and Sanha to grab their swords, stating that their goal was to kill him. He clarified that from that moment on, the training would be as close to real combat as possible. Muguk, horrified by the suggestion, immediately protested, fearing the severity of the training, especially with Sanha present. But Sanha, determined, set his eyes on his goal. He had already made up his mind. Without hesitation, he scooped up a handful of dirt and, in a flash of inspiration, he ditched the orthodox strats in the trash, then threw the dirt straight toward Muhoi's face. The unorthodox move took Muhoi by surprise, showing the young disciple's quick thinking and willingness to adapt. Without hesitation, Sanha charged forward, his sword gripped tightly in his hand. Determined to make the best of the situation, he resolved to give his all, despite his reluctance. He gritted his teeth, mentally preparing himself for the inevitable beating that would follow. In one swift motion, Sanha unsheathed his sword, swinging it horizontally toward Muhoi. His unorthodox approach proved to be effective, creating an opening. However, Muhoi wasn't particularly angered by the unorthodox strat. Instead, he simply covered his eyes with one hand and observed Sanha's movements closely. When Sanha came within range, Muhoi effortlessly kicked him, sending him hurtling through the air with a force that suggested no restraint. In truth, Muhoi had only exerted a fraction of his strength, careful not to kill the young man. Meanwhile, Muguk remained kneeling on the ground, seemingly oblivious to the intense situation unfolding around him. He turned his head, calling out to his son, as Sanha crashed some distance away. However, Muguk had little time to worry about his son, as his instinct screamed for him to react. He quickly turned his head back. In the nick of time, Muguk ducked down, narrowly avoiding a horizontal strike from Muhoi's sword. Muhoi stopped the swing abruptly and then brought the sword down, the blade striking the ground just as Muguk leaped backward. He landed beside Sanha, who called out to him, prompting Muguk to ask if his son was okay. Despite the pain, Sanha assured his father he could endure it. Muguk expressed relief at hearing his son's response. But before they could fully recover, Muhoi appeared behind them, almost as though materializing out of thin air. Muhoi casually questioned whether they planned to chat during the duel. Both father and son turned in surprise to face the Manhwa disciple. Muguk was the first to respond. He swung his sword at Muhoi, but the strike was easily stopped by Muhoi's hand, done with effortless ease. Muhoi's words were laced with calm authority. He reminded them to treat the duel as real combat, stressing that only by moving as if their lives depended on it could both the sect leader and his son survive. With a chilling calmness, Muhoi prepared for the next round. At that moment, both Muguk and Sanha understood the gravity of the situation. They knew they would face severe consequences if they didn't commit fully to the sparring. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Muguk remained determined, putting everything he had into each of his sword strikes. However, Muhoi stood like an unmovable wall, blocking each attack as if sparring with a child, displaying an unsettling indifference. Muguk kept charging, launching strike after strike, but Muhoi stepped back with calculated precision, evading each one. In a sudden motion, Muhoi landed a punch to Muguk's face, causing him to involuntarily close his eyes. In that instant, Muhoi brandished his sword, placing it at Muguk's neck, forcing him to open his eyes in surprise. Muhoi's voice was casual but precise as he mentioned that Muguk had died 314 times. He then reminded Muguk that closing his eyes made it difficult to react to attacks. Muguk attempted to defend himself, arguing that even with his eyes closed, he could still sense movements using his internal energy. Muhoi acknowledged that internal energy, if properly used, could grant a sense akin to sight. He noted that it was an essential skill, one that should not be difficult for a sect leader like Muguk. He then posed a simple but undeniable question. If Muguk could sense the movements, why couldn't he dodge? Muguk, attempting to justify himself, admitted that Muhoi's attacks were simply too fast. Muhoi scoffed at the excuse. He pointed out that if Muguk had kept his eyes open, he could have easily dodged the attacks. Even with his eyes closed, proper use of internal energy would have been enough to sense the incoming strikes. Muhoi's words were sharp. He reminded Muguk that mistakes in combat were not something to blame on other factors. If a mistake led to death, there would be no second chances. As he withdrew his sword, preparing for the next round, he emphasized the importance of not letting such mistakes happen. With a firm kick, Muhoi pushed Muguk back and signaled the beginning of the next bout. Despite the exhaustion, Muguk's determination remained unshaken. He gritted his teeth, ready to continue. As the sun finally started to disappear behind the mountain range, Muguk charged once more toward Muhoi, a renewed resolve in his movements. Meanwhile, Muhoi stood in place, perfectly poised and ready for whatever attack Muguk would offer. Manhwa lay on the ground, utterly drained from the sparring. The day eventually gave way to night. Muguk, completely spent, collapsed onto the ground. Muhoi, however, remained standing, unwavering. Turning his attention to Manhwa, Muhoi instructed him to keep going, as though his stamina were limitless. Through the night, Manhwa endured a relentless beating, all the while receiving continuous instructions from Muhoi. As soon as Muguk regained enough strength to stand, he immediately rejoined the sparring. With each exchange, their movements grew sharper and more precise. By the end of the night, Muguk had reached a point where he could keep his eyes open to track Muhoi's sword strikes. But the training was far from over. For 3 consecutive days, Muhoi continued to push both father and son to their limits. The two men sparred until they could barely move. As soon as they regained enough strength, Muhoi was back in position, ready to continue the training without pause. Elsewhere, the leader of the Great Truth Sect sat with a sword master he had hired. The sword master, Yonho Blade Master, remarked that if the second-generation disciple of Manhwa Sect were truly skilled, the energy-charged sword should have been more than enough to defeat him. The Great Truth Sect leader admitted that while that might be true, his real goal was to humiliate the Manhwa disciples thoroughly. The leader of the sect suggested that to put the Manhwa disciples in their place, it would be better to do so overwhelmingly, to ensure their defeat was undeniable. Yonho responded with a wry smile, acknowledging his swordsmanship, but pointing out that calling it overwhelming seemed a bit much. Yonho's grin deepened, stating that regardless of the outcome, the Manhwa disciples would be lucky not to be crippled. Still, Yonho voiced his concerns, asking if the sect leader was sure about this approach. If someone were to get injured, or worse, killed, it could cause significant problems for them. The leader of the Great Truth Sect shrugged off the concern, dismissing rumors as irrelevant. Yonho raised an eyebrow, challenging the sect leader's casual dismissal of the situation. If rumors were truly so inconsequential, why was he so worried about them? If things went wrong, it wouldn't just be Manhwa they would need to worry about. Every other faction in Jianghu might take notice and start to hold them in check. The leader assured him not to worry. There was already a faction in Jianghu with a similar reputation, and he was confident he could handle any potential fallout from their actions. Yonho, deep in thought, began to question the sect leader's arrogance. He wondered how far the leader was willing to push things. Could someone who disregarded the possible consequences truly be so sure of their strength? Yonho contemplated the situation carefully, his thoughts turning to the Fresh Flower sect leader, whose martial arts were competent, but still a step below his own. Was this arrogance blinding the leader to the risks? Was the leader's greed starting to cloud his judgment? With a sense of finality, Yonho concluded that once this situation was over, it might be time to seek a new place to belong. On the night before the duel, Muhoi sat atop a pavilion roof in the Fresh Flower Sect, watching Mukiel train diligently in the yard below. As he observed Mukiel's movements, Muhoi evaluated him with a critical eye. The young disciple moved well with the sword, though it wasn't particularly heavy. It might be time for Mukiel to switch to a heavier blade, possibly even a great sword, Muhoi thought to himself. His thoughts quickly shifted to the Great Truth Sect and their possible plans. Though Muhoi had expected them to send assassins, he was surprised by how quiet they had been. It seemed they underestimated both Manhwa and the Fresh Flower Sect. Muhoi scowled inwardly. If the Great Truth Sect had sent assassins, he could have used that as a reason to raze them to the ground, but it seemed they weren't bold enough to make that move. What a shame, Muhoi thought. Just then, Muhoi heard footsteps. To his surprise, Muguk, the leader of the Fresh Flower Sect, was walking through the yard, deep in thought. Muguk's expression was serene, his eyes calm and full of life as he gazed at the distance, completely unfazed by the impending duel the following day. There was no sign of fear or anxiety in his demeanor. After a while, he turned and headed back to his residence. Muhoi, observing the scene, thought to himself that the sect leader didn't linger for too long. He simply looked at the moon before leaving, his thoughts no doubt on the duel. Muhoi reflected on the fact that Muguk's eldest son had died in a duel against the Great Truth Sect. In a sense, tomorrow's duel could be seen as an act of revenge. Muhoi wondered what that kind of revenge felt like, finally avenging a loss. As the night passed and the sun rose, the scene shifted to the arena where the duel would take place. The martial artists of the Great Truth Sect, upon seeing Santa's battered face, were surprised and curious. They couldn't understand what had happened to the young master of the Fresh Flower Sect, his face swollen and bruised, barely able to open his right eye. Sanha entered the arena unfazed, standing before the young master of the Great Truth Sect. Despite the obvious signs of his previous sparring with Muhoi, his sole focus was on himself. The Great Truth Sect's young master mocked Sanha, remarking on his pathetic appearance and claiming to feel sorry for him, though his words were laced with sarcasm. Sanha, however, ignored him completely, his thoughts consumed by his complaint about the duel. He voiced his frustration that they would be using wooden swords for the contest. The harsh training from Muhoi had left its mark, not just on Santa's battered face, but on his tone as well. The spoiled young master dismissed the concern with a smirk, remarking on how fortunate it was that the weapon in his hand was not a real sword. If it had been, he mused, he might have accidentally killed his opponent. His words carried the usual arrogance, yet there was no immediate response. Sanha remained motionless, prompting his adversary to ponder the unusual stillness. Something felt off. Typically, Sanha would react in anger to even the slightest provocation, but now he stood eerily calm. The spoiled young master felt irritation creeping in. Was he being ignored? The thought alone stoked his fury as he fixed a heated glare upon his opponent. As the tension in the air thickened, the referee's voice cut through it with authority. With a composed demeanor, Hyong Hongwon stepped forward, announcing his role as the observer and referee for the duel. He explained the nature of the fight, a comparison of martial skills where injuries were inevitable. However, should the situation grow too severe, he would intervene at his own discretion. Regardless of the outcome, all 3 rounds of the duel would proceed, a rule that all present were expected to acknowledge. The gathered disciples listened attentively, anticipation hanging heavy among them. Amidst the crowd, Muhoi lounged with ease. Despite having gone without rest since instigating the duel, his sharp presence remained undiminished. His attention, however, did not linger on the match between the 2 young masters. Having personally trained Sanha, he harbored no concern over the boy losing to a spoiled opponent. Instead, his gaze settled on an individual among the ranks of the opposing sect. Among the disciples of the Great Truth Sect sat the Blade Master, Yonho. All indications suggested that he would be the 3rd participant in the duel, taking the place of the strongest combatant. Muhoi seemed recognized him, yet he regarded his presence with nonchalance, quietly wondering why the Blade Master had come. Meanwhile, Hyong concluded his explanation, remarking on how much he had spoken before acknowledging that such an introduction was necessary. He requested understanding from those present, then swiftly moved to the main event. With a final declaration, he announced the beginning of the first duel. At that moment, the Great Truth Sect's young master surged forward, closing the distance between himself and his opponent with 2 rapid strides. A battle cry erupted from his lips, an eager proclamation of his intent to utterly crush his adversary. His wooden sword swung wide, aiming to land a decisive strike. Yet Manhwa remained still. The attack came from the very same boy who had tormented him daily, the same one who had tirelessly sought to stir conflict between their sect. But now, standing before him, Manhwa saw through it all. His movements carried unnecessary flourish. The gestures felt exaggerated, too grand, too overdone. In truth, they were precisely that. Muhoi's past teachings echoed in Manhwa's mind, recalling the wisdom imparted to him. Fighters who lacked true strength often exaggerated their movements, hoping to create an illusion of dominance. They sought to intimidate, to make opponents shrink away in fear. That was their true objective. For those unfamiliar with martial arts or possessing only a shallow understanding, such intimidation might prove effective. But for those who had even a basic grasp of combat, the tactic was nothing more than a useless display. These lessons had shaped Manhwa, and now he stood before his opponent with unwavering resolve, his sword already poised for action. In the brief span of a single breath, Manhwa shifted. His hand drew back slightly before launching forward with precision, striking just below his opponent's chest. The impact reverberated through the spoiled young master's body, his insides twisting from a force. The strike had been executed with such speed that he failed to react in time. But Manhwa did not stop. Even as his first attack landed, his other hand was already in motion. His fist connected with the young master's face, sending him hurtling backward with ruthless force. Though Manhwa remained unaffected by his opponent's taunts, the power behind his strikes showed no mercy. A cheer erupted from the Fresh Flower Sect's ranks as one of the disciples voiced their confidence. As expected of their young master, they had never doubted his ability. Only after enduring the relentless blows did the spoiled young master realize the full extent of what had happened. Gasping for breath, he finally registered that Manhwa had not even moved from his original spot. The pain coursing through his body was undeniable, the sensation far too intense for him to comprehend. He struggled to accept that Manhwa's attacks could hurt this much. A chilling realization dawned upon him. His opponent was no longer the same person he once knew. Something about him had changed. His battered face remained familiar, his external appearance unchanged. Yet there was something different, something that eluded him. His thoughts drifted toward the possibility of Manhwa having consumed an elixir, much like he himself had done. Meanwhile, Manhwa's mind remained unclouded. The days spent training with the disciples of Manhwa under Muhoi's rigorous guidance had been nothing short of hell. That period of relentless sparring had reshaped him entirely. Through those grueling experiences, he had come to understand just how weak someone like the spoiled brat before him truly was. The defeated young master, struggling to make sense of what had transpired, demanded an explanation. His voice rang with disbelief as he shouted accusations, questioning what trick had been used. How could someone grow this strong in such a short period? Before an answer could be uttered, Manhwa swiftly kicked his opponent's leg, knocking him off balance once again. The brat barely had time to stabilize himself before being thrown down again. Yet Manhwa remained indifferent. His resolve shone through his partially opened eyes, unwavering in its intensity. To him, this was nothing more than child's play, merely a minor scuffle compared to the battles where he had fought with his life on the line. The spoiled brat collapsed once more, his incompetence on full display. He had failed to inflict even the smallest injury upon Manhwa, yet he himself had been taken down repeatedly. Manhwa observed the fallen opponent, unimpressed. Despite the duel still being in progress, his adversary remained slow to rise, distracted by his own complaints. Gassian recognized something in Manhwa's voice, a warning, an impending strike. If this were a real battle, Manhwa remarked coldly, Gassian would already be dead. Panic overtook the fallen young master. Through teary eyes, he cried out, pleading for mercy. The arrogance once plastered across his face had vanished. leaving behind only raw, unfiltered fear. Santa showed no interest in his pleas. Without hesitation, his sword descended, carrying the same ferocity and mercilessness as before. Terror gripped Gassian entirely, his face drained of all color, his expression mirroring that of prey before a predator's final strike. The sword, however, did not touch him. It crashed onto the floor beside him, its edge harmless. And yet, the damage had already been done. The once proud young talent of Wayan had been reduced to nothing more than a trembling child, utterly broken. Santa scoffed at the fallen figure, his voice laced with disdain. Once, they had called him the greatest genius of Wayan, but from this moment forward, he would carry a different title, the biggest coward of Wayan. Witnesses from both sects stood in silent shock as the scene unfolded. Then, amidst the silence, something unmistakable occurred. Gassian, in front of all present, lost control, the humiliation complete. With no will left to fight, the observer made the official call. The first duel had ended in victory for the Fresh Flower Sect. The leader of the Great Truth Sect clenched his fists, seething with rage. The brat had dared to humiliate his son, swinging a sword so seriously in what was supposed to be a children's duel. Santa had come fully prepared. In a muttered breath, he voiced his displeasure. He had even given Gassian an elixir as a precaution, never once considering that he would still lose. But in the end, it mattered little. Victory in the remaining 2 duels was all but assured. His confidence did not waver, for he believed there would be no trouble securing a win against Muhoi. The arena was swiftly cleared as the observer called for the next participants. And so, the moment arrived. The leaders of both sects stepped forward to face one another. Muhoi studied his opponent carefully. A few months ago, rumors had circulated that the Great Truth Sect leader had taken a rare elixir. Now, standing before him, Muhoi could confirm with certainty that the rumors were true. Yet even with this revelation, his expression remained unshaken. He had spent his time preparing for this very moment, and now, unnecessary thoughts had no place in his mind. Emotions were meaningless. He would face this battle just as he had faced training under Master Muhoi. His opponent, however, took notice of Muhoi's demeanor. The Great Truth Sect leader understood that his adversary must have realized the truth about the elixir. And yet, Muhoi's face showed nothing but composure, more so than before. Scoffing inwardly, the sect leader mused to himself. That calm expression would not last for long. The observer's voice rang out once more, signaling the start of the second bout. The moment the announcement was made, the Great Truth Sect master vanished from sight. Yet, Muhoi remained composed, his senses heightened as he extended his inner energy to feel his surroundings. He stood still, waiting for the inevitable strike. In a fraction of a second, a swift attack came from the side, aimed directly at his neck. Instinct took over as Muhoi ducked just in time, the blade missing its mark by a hair's breadth. Without hesitation, he seized his opponent's arm, and in one fluid motion, he swung his sword wide, aiming for the opponent's head. The Great Truth Sect leader reacted instantly, pulling his head back just enough to avoid a fatal strike. The blade barely grazed his cheek, drawing a thin line of blood, but he showed no sign of hesitation. In response, he retaliated with a powerful kick to Muhoi's chest. However, Muhoi raised his sword at the last moment, using its flat side to absorb the impact. Despite successfully blocking the kick, the force behind it sent him staggering back a few steps. A smug voice broke the tension. The Great Truth Sect leader admitted that he had been restraining his strength, cautious after a previous incident, but he now saw no need for such restraint. However, Muhoi remained silent. The provocation meant nothing to him, and his unwavering focus stayed locked on his opponent. Declaring that he would fight with his full strength, the Great Truth Sect leader lunged forward once more. His movements carried greater power now, his attacks fueled by true intent. He brought his sword down with force, yet for all his strength his stance was flawed. Muhoi read the movement with ease and met the strike head-on. As their blades clashed, Muhoi felt himself slightly pushed back, but his footing remained firm. Sparks scattered from the collision of steel, and the sharp clang of metal echoed through the arena. The battle intensified, neither side relenting. Each exchanged blow reverberated through the air, the world around them silenced by the relentless rhythm of clashing swords. The wind itself seemed to vanish, replaced solely by the sound of their deadly contest. Muguk's keen eyes caught every flaw in his opponent's form. Each time the Great Truth Sect leader linked his techniques, small openings appeared. When he swung upward, generating a powerful sword wind, his right thigh became momentarily exposed. Every weakness, every gap in his defense stood out, thanks to the rigorous training Muguk had endured. Had the Great Truth Sect leader trained under Master Muhoi, these bad habits would have long been corrected. For a time, Muguk had believed that defeating his opponent would require either luck or an elixir. But now, with clarity born from relentless training, he understood something far more valuable. Master Muhoi had not simply beaten strength into him. He had given him the ability to see through his opponent. Confidence surged through him. The years of hardship, the grueling sessions of training, all had led to this moment. With unwavering resolve, Muguk lifted his sword, his grip tightening. Then, with a single step, he closed the distance in an instant. His blade cut clean through the opening in his opponent's side. A sharp gasp escaped the Great Truth Sect leader as blood sprayed from the deep wound, painting the battlefield in crimson.